Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Find the position your body wants to rest in. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop and let the day you have carried begin to set itself down. Tonight, we are spending a single day in a small English town where no one has much money, and no one will ever admit it, from the dark before the first candle to the last one blown out at night. There is nothing here you need to follow closely. The story moves at the pace of breathing, and it is meant to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, you're warmly welcome to follow the channel, so that another evening like this one can find you when you need it. A quiet like, or a few words left below about where you are listening from tonight, helps others discover these stories too. There is no hurry to do any of it. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. None of it asks anything of you now. For now there is only this, the warmth around you, the slow settling of the night, a long, gentle story waiting to begin. So let your eyes close if they wish to. Let your breathing slow, and when you are ready we will step into a cold parlour in the dark before the candles are lit. There's a town I want to take you to tonight, a small one, in the north of England sometime in the 1830s. It doesn't matter exactly when. Time moves slowly here, and the ladies who run this place would prefer you didn't ask too many questions about dates, because dates lead to numbers, and numbers lead to money, and money is not something anyone in this town will ever discuss. It's a town of women mostly, spinsters and widows, living alone in narrow houses with one servant or none at all. Their husbands, if they ever had them, have long since disappeared, to regiments, to ships, to business in some larger, louder city 20 miles down the railroad. The women stayed, and in the staying they built something, not wealth, something stranger than that. A kind of dignity so careful, so perfectly maintained, that after a while you can't tell whether it's pride or tenderness, or just the quiet stubbornness of people who've decided that the way they live is the only way worth living. No one here has much money. You'd know that within an hour of arriving. You'd see it in the thinness of the bread and butter at evening parties, in the way a woman walks home through the rain rather than hire a chair, in the single candle burning where two ought to be. But you'd never hear it said. Not once, because in this town poverty is not a fact. It is a word, and that word is unspeakable. What they have instead is something they call elegant economy. And if you stay long enough, you'll start to believe in it yourself. I want you to come and watch how it works. How a woman can host a party in a room the size of a nursery, and have her guests talk about the servants' hall as if it exists. How another can sit knitting in the dark for 3 hours because candles cost money, and call it keeping blind man's holiday. How a supper of lobster and oysters and cherry brandy can appear on a table in a house that was, until 5 years ago, a milliner's shop, and every guest will eat and drink and cough and pretend they've never tasted anything so strong in all their lives. These aren't grand people, they aren't famous. History didn't write their names down anywhere, but they kept their backs straight and their caps clean and their curtains white, and they walked through the mud in wooden pattens and came home by lantern light at 9 o'clock, and they called it a life. And it was. So come with me, and we'll spend a day among them. We won't rush. We'll watch them wake in the cold, and dress in clothes that are 10 years out of fashion, and pay their calls and pour their tea, and play their cards for 3-penny stakes. And by the time the last candle goes out, I think you'll understand something about them that's hard to put into words, but easy, very easy, to fall asleep to. Let me take you there now. The parlour is cold. The fire hasn't caught yet, and somewhere in the dark a woman is reaching for her knitting needles. The fire hasn't been built up yet. That's the first thing you'd notice, if you were here, the cold of the room and the way the light sits. It isn't dark, not exactly. There's a window, and beyond it a November sky the colour of old pewter, and enough of that grey afternoon light comes through the glass to show you the shape of the parlour. A small room, a very small room, 2 chairs drawn close to the hearth, a low table between them, a work basket on the floor with a half-finished stocking spilling out of it. The hearth itself holds a fire that's been allowed to burn down to a low orange glow. Not dead, not warm, just ticking along on its last few coals, giving off that faint smell of ash and wood smoke that seeps into everything in a house like this. The curtains, the chair cushions, the shawl draped over the back of the settee. Everything here smells quietly of fire. And there, in the chair nearest the hearth, sits Miss Hatty Pemberton. She's somewhere past 50, though you wouldn't ask and she wouldn't tell you. A soft-faced woman with a mild, slightly startled expression, as if the world has just said something unexpected and she's still deciding whether to be worried about it. Her spectacles are folded on the table beside her. No use for them now, not in this light. Her hands are moving. That's the second thing you'd notice. Even in this half-light, even with the fire barely glowing and the candles not yet lit, her fingers are working a pair of knitting needles with the kind of steady automatic rhythm that comes from decades of practice. She doesn't need to see. She knows where the wool is. She knows where the needle goes. Click, click, click. The sound is as regular as a clock and just as soothing, and if you sat here long enough you'd stop hearing it at all. She calls this keeping blind man's holiday. It's an old phrase, and she uses it the way you'd use a comfortable pair of shoes, without thinking, because it fits. What it means in practice is that Miss Hatty Pemberton will sit in this chair from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the November light starts to fail, until Annie brings in the candle with the tea sometime around 5. That's 2 hours, give or take. 2 hours of sitting in the gathering dark, knitting by feel, listening to the coals settle, letting her thoughts go where they will. Sometimes she hums, not a tune exactly, just a slow, absent sound, barely more than breathing. Sometimes she talks in her sleep, if the warmth of the shawl and the steadiness of the needles have drawn her under. Small words, quiet ones, names that belong to people who are no longer alive. She doesn't know she does this, and Annie, downstairs in the kitchen, can't hear her, so the words go nowhere. They just hang in the dark parlour for a moment, and then they're gone. Annie. The girl's name is Annie, broad-shouldered, plain-faced, with the kind of scrubbed complexion that comes from years of outdoor work. She came to this house from a farm 2 parishes over, and hasn't yet learned the particular silences of this place. She's strong-armed and plain-spoken, and she still closes doors a little too hard and sets down teacups a little too firmly, and Miss Hatty flinches each time but hasn't the heart to correct her, because the girl means well and tries hard and has nobody else to go to. In the kitchen below, Annie is doing something with the kettle. You can hear the scrape of iron on the range, the clink of the lid, the soft rush of water being poured. She doesn't know that her mistress is sitting upstairs in the dark. Or rather, she knows it but doesn't understand it. On the farm where she grew up, you lit a candle when it got dark. That was the whole of it. This business of sitting without light, of choosing darkness when a match and a candlestick were right there on the mantelpiece. It puzzles her. But she doesn't ask. She's learning slowly that in this house there are questions you don't put into words, and the reason, if you ask Miss Hatty, would never be candles. She'd never say it was about candles. She'd say she preferred to rest her eyes. She'd say the firelight was quite enough for knitting. She might even say, in her gentle apologetic way, that she found the half-dark rather peaceful, and she wouldn't be lying exactly. She's lived in this half-dark long enough that it probably is peaceful, in the way that anything becomes peaceful once you've stopped fighting it. But the truth underneath, the truth that she'd sooner swallow a pin than say aloud, is that candles cost money. And money is not a thing that Miss Hatty Pemberton talks about. Not to me, not to you, not to anyone. Let me tell you about her candles, because they're worth knowing about. She has 2. That's important. 2, not 1. They sit in a pair of plain brass holders on the mantelpiece, and if you glanced at them you'd think nothing of it. 2 candles, roughly the same height, waiting to be lit. But here's the thing. Miss Hatty only ever lights 1 at a time. 1 candle per evening. That's the rule. Though she'd never call it a rule. It's just how things are done. The second one is there for appearances. In case a friend should call. In case someone should knock at the door and need to be received in a properly lit room. If that happened, both candles would be burning, and the visitor would see a lady sitting in decent light, as any lady ought to. They'd never guess that 5 minutes earlier the room had been nearly dark. But there's a complication, and this is the part I can't let go of. If you only burn 1 candle each evening, and you alternate between them, this one tonight, that one tomorrow, they ought to stay roughly the same height, and they would if you burned each one for exactly the same number of hours. But evenings aren't all the same length. Some nights Annie brings the tea early, some nights a conversation goes on a little longer, or a passage of knitting gets complicated and needs more light, or Miss Hatty simply forgets to blow the candle out at the usual time, and so the 2 candles drift apart by half an inch by an inch, and then they don't match anymore, and 2 candles of different heights, sitting side by side on a mantelpiece, tell a story. They say, "This household only burns one at a time." They say, "This woman is counting." So Miss Hatty watches, whatever else is happening in the room, whatever she's saying, whatever she's knitting, whatever Annie is clattering about in the kitchen below, one eye is always on the candle, and the moment it starts to burn lower than its partner, she's up. Quietly, without fuss, she pinches out the short one and lights the tall one. Then tomorrow night they'll swap again, and the day after that, and by the end of the week they'll be level. 2 candles, the same height, standing on the mantelpiece like soldiers, and if anyone should happen to glance at them, they'll see nothing at all. Just a lady who burns 2 candles, as anyone would. You know what stays with me about this? It isn't the thrift. Thrift is common enough, and plenty of people save candle ends without making a ceremony of it. What stays with me is the watching. The way her eyes would drift to the mantelpiece mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-stitch. The way she'd register the difference in height the way a sailor registers the wind, automatically, without breaking her attention from whatever else was happening. She'd been doing it so long that it wasn't even effort anymore. It was part of the rhythm of her evenings, as natural as breathing, and I think if you'd asked her why she did it, she wouldn't have been able to explain. Not because it was a secret, but because it was so deep in her that she couldn't see it from the outside anymore. It was just what she did. It was just how you lived. And candles aren't the only thing. Everyone in this town has their own small economy, their own private little kingdom of saving that they guard with a fierceness out of all proportion to the pennies involved. Miss Hatty's is candles, but I've known a man, an old gentleman, mild as milk in every other respect, who once worried his family for an entire summer's day because someone had torn a page out of a notebook instead of cutting it cleanly. The book was worthless. The bank it belonged to had already failed, and every penny he'd put into it was gone. But the torn page, that ragged edge where a clean cut should have been, that was the thing that kept him pacing. The money he could bear, the waste of paper he could not, and envelopes. When envelopes first came into fashion, all that folded paper wrapped around a letter just to carry it 20 miles. Miss Hatty's father, the old rector, couldn't abide them. The waste offended him somewhere deep, so he took to turning every envelope inside out when it arrived, pressing it flat with his thumbnail, smoothing the creases against the edge of his desk and reusing it for his own correspondence. He did this for years, long past the point where anyone would have noticed or cared, because by then it wasn't about the paper, it was about the principle. A thing that could be used twice should be used twice. A thing that could be saved should be saved. And the world was full of things that people threw away too soon. Then there are people who hoard string. I know this because I'm one of them. My pockets are full of little twisted hanks of it, saved from parcels and packages and bundles, wound up and tucked away for a use that never quite arrives. I can't throw string away. It feels like throwing away a small promise. And I'm truly annoyed when someone takes a pair of scissors to a perfectly good knot instead of working it loose with their fingers. That knot was holding something together. It deserved patience, not a blade. I have an India rubber ring too. I found it on the ground one morning 5 or 6 years back now, and I've never used it. I've tried. I've held it in my hand and thought about stretching it around a bundle of letters or a rolled up piece of cloth, and each time my heart fails me. Because once you've used it, it's used. It's been stretched. It's a little weaker, a little looser, a little closer to the end of its useful life. And right now, sitting in the bottom of my work basket, it's perfect. It could do anything. It could hold anything together, as long as I never ask it to. And then there are the butter watchers. I don't know what else to call them. These are people who cannot concentrate on a single word you're saying if there's a piece of butter left on someone's plate across the table. They stare at it. They will it to be eaten. They'd almost rather eat it themselves, just to make it gone, just to end the agony, than watch it sit there turning soft and greasy in the warm air. And when the person whose plate it is suddenly tears off a piece of bread they didn't want and uses it to mop up the last smear, oh, the relief. You can see it pass across the butter watcher's face like sunlight after rain. The bread was unnecessary. The butter was a fraction of a penny. But something in the universe has been set right, and they can finally hear what you're saying again. Miss Hatty inherited this instinct from her father and her sister both. Not the envelope specifically, not the butter, but the feeling underneath, that waste is a kind of small violence, and that a careful life, a life where nothing is lost, nothing squandered, nothing spent without thought, has a dignity to it that a careless life can never quite match. She saves the ends of candles. She saves ribbons from old bonnets and stitches them onto new ones. She saves the brown paper that parcels come wrapped in, smoothing it out on the kitchen table and folding it into a drawer. And somewhere in the back of a chest upstairs, tucked among her mother's letters, there are small dried Tonquin beans that still give off a faint sweet smell after all these years. A scent like vanilla and old wood and something else, something powdery and warm that belongs to a time before Miss Hatty was Miss Hatty. Her mother kept them among her papers, and now they live among the yellow bundles of old letters that nobody reads anymore, and nobody can quite bring themselves to burn. She doesn't open that chest often, but when she does, the smell rises up and fills the room for a moment, and she stands very still and breathes, and then she closes the lid again, gently, the way you'd close a door on someone sleeping. The room is getting darker now. The pewter sky outside the window has deepened to something closer to iron, and the shapes of the furniture are starting to blur at the edges. Miss Hatty's needles haven't stopped. Click, click, click. She's on the heel of a stocking now, turning it, counting stitches by touch. Her lips move slightly as she counts, a habit from girlhood that she never quite grew out of. The fire settles, and a coal drops, and a brief flare of orange light catches the side of her face. She looks for a moment very young. Then the coal dims, and she's herself again. A woman past 50, alone in a cold room knitting in the dark, and then a sound from below. The slow, heavy tread of Annie coming up the stairs, and the faint rattle of a cup on a saucer, and the particular creak of the third step from the top that Annie hasn't learned to avoid yet. Miss Hatty straightens in her chair. She sets down her knitting. She reaches for the candle, tonight's candle, the left one, because last night it was the right, and strikes a match. The flame catches. The room fills with that warm, unsteady, golden light that only a single candle can give, and suddenly every surface has a shadow, and the brass fender gleams, and the work basket on the floor looks like a painting of a work basket, rich and deep and full of colour that wasn't there a moment ago. Annie comes in with the tray, tea, and 2 slices of thin bread and butter, and a small pot of damson jam that Miss Hatty made herself last September from the tree in the back garden. The bread is cut thin enough to see your hand through almost, but it's good bread, and the butter is real, and the jam is thick and dark and tastes of autumn. Annie sets it down without ceremony. She's not a girl who fusses, and she hasn't yet learned the particular way that Miss Hatty likes the cup turned with the handle to the right, and goes back downstairs. And Miss Hatty pours her tea and cuts her bread into careful halves, and eats quietly in the light of one candle, while the second stands on the mantelpiece beside it, unlit, patient, waiting for a visitor who will not come tonight. But she's ready. That's the thing. She's always ready. If someone knocked on that door right now, the second candle would be lit before they reached the top of the stairs, and they'd walk into a room that looked like any gentlewoman's parlour on any November evening in England. 2 candles burning, a fire built up in the grate, a lady at her tea. Nothing to suggest that 5 minutes ago the room was dark. Nothing to suggest that the bread is thin because bread costs money, or that the jam is homemade because shop jam is an extravagance, or that the reason there's no sugar bowl on the tray is that Miss Hatty takes her tea without, and has done for years, and would tell you if asked that she simply prefers it plain. The candle burns, the tea cools in her cup, and outside the last of the daylight drains out of the November sky, and the town of Wenbury settles into its long early dark. There is a word in Wenbury that carries more weight than any other. It isn't a curse. It isn't an insult, not in the ordinary sense. If you heard it spoken aloud in a drawing room in London, you'd barely notice it. But here, in this small town, in these narrow parlours where the curtains are always clean, and the silver always polished, and the bread is always cut just a little thinner than it needs to be, here, this word can end a reputation. It can close a door that will never open again. It can take a woman who has lived respectably for 40 years and place her quietly, permanently, outside the circle of people who matter. The word is vulgar. I want you to hear it the way the ladies of Wenbury hear it. Not as a mild judgment, not as a passing remark, but as something closer to a sentence. When Miss Augusta Finch leans toward you at a tea table, and lowers her voice and says that a certain person's curtains are... And here she pauses and her mouth tightens and you can see her choosing the word as carefully as a surgeon chooses a blade. Vulgar. What she means is that the person behind those curtains has committed a sin against the order of things, not a moral sin. Something worse. A sin against taste, against discretion, against the delicate, unspoken agreement that holds the entire town together, like whalebone in a corset. And what is that agreement? It's simple, really, though it took me a long time to see it clearly, because nobody ever states it. Nobody can. Stating it would be the most vulgar act of all. But if I had to put it into words, and I'll do it quietly here, where nobody from Wenbury can hear me, it would go something like this. We are all poor, and we will all pretend we are not. That's it. That's the whole of it. Every rule, every custom, every particular way of doing things in this town flows from that single unspoken sentence. And the reason the word vulgar has such power here is that vulgarity is the name they give to anything that threatens the pretense. Anything that lets the truth in. Anything that reminds you, even for a moment, that the bread is thin because bread costs money. And so they've built a language around it. A whole parallel language, running alongside the ordinary one, where every sentence means something slightly different from what it says. If a lady of Wenbury walks to a party through the November dark, in wooden pattens that clatter on the cobblestones, and a calash that makes her look, I'm sorry but it's true, like a large startled beetle, she isn't walking because she can't afford a chair. She's walking because the night is so fine. Those are the exact words. The night is so fine, and if it's raining or sleeting or the mud is ankle deep, then the air is so refreshing. And if you happen to notice that the Honourable Mrs. Blackwood is the only woman in Wenbury who arrives at parties in a sedan chair, you certainly wouldn't connect that fact to the further fact that Mrs. Blackwood is the only woman in Wenbury who has any real money. You'd simply observe that Mrs. Blackwood prefers a chair and leave it at that. The same goes for clothes. If a lady wears printed cotton instead of silk in summer, good, sensible, hard-wearing cotton that can be washed and starched and made to look fresh week after week, she isn't wearing it because silk costs 3 times as much. She's wearing it because she prefers a material that washes well. She likes the pattern. She finds cotton more practical for the country. And everyone around her nods and agrees and says how sensible, and nobody, not once, in the entire history of this conversation, will mention the price of silk. It floats there, just behind the words, enormous and obvious and absolutely invisible, like a horse standing in a parlour that everyone has agreed not to see. I keep thinking about this, about the sheer effort of it, the concentration it must take day after day, year after year, to live inside a story that everyone knows is a story, and nobody's allowed to call one. You'd think it would be exhausting. You'd think someone would crack, would blurt out the truth over tea some afternoon, would say the word money the way you'd say weather or Wednesday, just casually, as if it were an ordinary part of life. And in fact, it did happen once. A retired officer settled in Wenbury some years back, a bluff, kind-hearted man who'd spent his career in regiments where people said what they meant, and on his very first week in town he did something so extraordinary that people talked about it for months. He mentioned, in public, on the street, in a voice that could be heard from one end of the pavement to the other, that he was poor. He used the word. He said it out loud. He even gave his poverty as the explanation for choosing a smaller house. Said it cheerfully, matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention that it was Tuesday. The effect was remarkable. You'd have thought he'd taken his boots off in church. The ladies of Wenbury drew in their breath and looked at one another, and for a few days there was talk of refusing to call on him entirely. Because here's the thing, it wasn't just that he'd broken the rule, it was that his breaking it made the rule visible. If one person could stand on a public pavement and say I am poor without the sky falling in, then what exactly were the rest of them protecting? What was the point of the calashes and the thin bread and the walk to parties and the whole careful, exhausting architecture of elegant economy if a man could simply walk through the middle of it all and say the unsayable and nothing happened? They forgave him, eventually. He was too kind, too useful, too genuinely good-natured to be kept out for long. He fixed their chimneys and advised on their drains and played cards for 3-penny stakes, with a gravity that made you think the pennies were guineas, and after a while the ladies decided he was simply eccentric. A man after all, and men couldn't be expected to understand these things, and they let him back in. But they never forgot, and nobody followed his example. The word money remained unsaid, and the word poor remained unthinkable, and the word vulgar remained the sharpest blade in the drawer. The rules extend to everything. Once you start looking, you can't stop seeing them. Take the evening parties. They begin early, 6:30, sometimes 7, and they end at 9. Always 9. 9 o'clock sharp, the card tables are folded, the candles are snuffed, and the ladies reach for their pattens and their cloaks and clatter home through the dark. And the reason, the official reason, is that keeping early hours is healthful and sensible, which it is. But the other reason, the one that lives underneath, is that an evening that runs past 9 requires more candles, more food, more coal on the fire. A party that ends at 9 can be managed on a tray of thin bread, a pot of tea, and a careful arrangement of 4 or 5 tallow candles. A party that runs to 11 needs supper, and supper, in Wenbury, is a word that smells faintly of expense, so they play cards. Preference mostly. Steady, predictable, gentle. Preference. The game of people who want something to do with their hands and something quiet to talk about while they do it. The stakes are 3-penny points. 3 pennies, and every woman at the table plays those pennies with a concentration and a seriousness that you'd think was being spent on a £100 wager at a London club. Because the 3-penny point isn't just a bet, it's a declaration. It says, this is the right amount. This is what respectable people play for. Anything more would be reckless. Anything less would suggest you couldn't afford the 3. And food, the food at these parties is an entire science of its own. I want you to imagine a tea tray at a Wenbury evening party, because it's one of the most carefully constructed objects in the English-speaking world. First, the tray itself. Good, heavy, old-fashioned silver, polished until you can see your own face in it, because a tray can be polished for free. On it, cups of thin, translucent china, the kind that lets the light through, because a woman can inherit fine china and keep it for decades without spending a penny. Then the food, thin bread and butter, cut so fine the butter is barely a memory, sponge biscuits, light as a dry leaf, and sometimes, on grand occasions at the very best parties, a slice of seed cake, dense, crumbling, faintly spiced with caraway. That's it. That's the whole spread. And it is, by the unwritten law of Wenbury, exactly right. Not too much, which would be showing off. Not too little, which would be admitting you hadn't enough. The perfect, precise, Goldilocks quantity of food for a gathering of gentlewomen who are all pretending not to be hungry. And wine. Wine is a chapter of its own. The decanters in Miss Hatty's dining room are beautiful. Cut glass, heavy in the hand, with silver labels hanging from their necks on fine chains. They've been in the family since her father's time, but they're only filled when there's company, and what goes into them is a story that would make a vintner weep. Because wine, once poured, doesn't get drunk, not all of it. A glass is filled, and half of it is sipped, and the rest sits on the table until the guest is gone, and then it goes back into the decanter. And when the decanter gets low, and a new occasion is coming, whatever dregs remain from the previous gathering, 4 months back, perhaps 5, get poured into the new bottle. The old mixes with the new, the 6-month sediment stirs into the fresh pour, and the result is something that is technically wine in the sense that it was once grapes, but has gone on a journey since then that no grape ever intended. Nobody comments on the taste. Nobody asks what year it is or where it came from. They sip and they nod, and they set the glass down again, and the agreement holds. And here's what gets me about all of this. The kindness. Because underneath the pretense, underneath the whole elaborate performance, there's something genuinely tender going on. The ladies of Wenbury don't maintain this fiction because they're vain or foolish or incapable of facing the truth. They maintain it because the alternative is shame. And shame, for a woman living alone on a fixed income in a small English town in the 1830s, isn't an abstract concept. It's a locked door. It's a cancelled invitation. It's the slow, quiet shrinking of a life that's already small enough. So instead of letting that happen, they've agreed, all of them, without a single word being spoken, to protect each other, to look the other way, to say the night is fine when it's pouring, and the cotton is a preference when it's a necessity, and the bread is thin because that's how they like it. They wrap each other's poverty in language the way you'd wrap a fragile thing in cloth, and they carry it between them, gently, and they never let it drop. And the word elegant is part of that wrapping. It matters, that word. It isn't just a softener. When they say elegant economy, they mean something specific. They mean this is not mere penny pinching. This is not the grim, teeth-gritted thrift of people who've given up. This is an art. This is a way of living with very little and making it look like enough. And that distinction between enough and very little is the space in which the entire dignity of Wenbury exists. Take that away and you've got a street full of anxious old women worrying about candles. Leave it in place and you've got a community of ladies practicing a craft so refined that most of the world will never even notice they're doing it. Mrs. Blackwood, the Honourable Mrs. Blackwood, and the Honourable matters because Mrs. Blackwood's late husband's brother was an earl, and this connection, tenuous as it is, gives her a position in Wenbury roughly equivalent to the position of the sun in the solar system. Mrs. Blackwood understands this better than anyone. She's not poor, or rather, she's less poor than the others, which in Wenbury amounts to the same thing as being rich. She has a sedan chair and a footman, and a dog named Carlo, who sits on a velvet cushion and is fed on the best scraps from the kitchen. But when she gives an evening party, the food on her table is exactly the same as the food on everyone else's. Wafer bread and butter, sponge biscuits, a thin, papery, geometrically precise slice of seed cake. Nothing more. Because if Mrs. Blackwood, with her earl's brother and her sedan chair and her velvet cushioned dog, were to put a lobster on her table, it would be an act of violence. It would say, I can afford this, and you cannot. It would tear a hole in the fabric of elegant economy that might never be mended. And Mrs. Blackwood, whatever else she may be, sleepy, a little vain, fond of talking about her late husband's family in a way that makes you want to lie down in a dark room, is a woman who understands the rules. So she serves wafer bread, and everyone eats it with quiet satisfaction, and everyone goes home by 9 o'clock and the agreement holds. There's a comfort in that, if you let yourself feel it. A kind of mutual gentleness disguised as snobbery. These women have very little. They've lost their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their money, their place in the larger world. What they've kept is each other, and the rules they've built together, and the small stubborn belief that a life lived carefully is still a life lived well. And the word vulgar, that terrible, sharp, annihilating word, isn't really about taste at all. It's about loyalty. It's about the promise not to see what you can plainly see, not to say what you already know, and to keep walking through the rain as if the night were fine. Because that's what they do for each other, and it's enough. The light in the parlour is warmer now. Miss Hatty has finished her tea, and Annie has come up to clear the tray, and somewhere across town another woman is reaching for her pattens and her calash, getting ready for the evening ahead. It occurs to me, sitting here watching the candle gutter, that what the ladies of Wenbury have really built is a kind of courtesy so deep it's become invisible, even to themselves. They've been practicing it so long that the performance and the truth have fused together, the way a river changes the shape of the ground beneath it, until you can't tell which came first, the water or the channel. Miss Hatty genuinely does prefer plain tea now. She's drunk it that way for so many years that sugar would taste wrong. Mrs. Blackwood genuinely does enjoy an early night. She falls asleep at parties anyway, so 9 o'clock suits her perfectly. And Miss Finch genuinely does like walking. It gives her time to gather news from people she meets on the road, which is her real occupation, and her real talent, though she'd never describe it that way. So maybe it doesn't matter anymore whether the story started as a lie. Maybe a lie told kindly, by everyone to everyone for long enough becomes something else. Becomes a way of seeing, becomes just how things are. The night is fine, the cotton washes well, the bread is thin because that's the way they like it, and if you listen carefully, underneath all of it, what you hear isn't deception. What you hear is a whole town saying very quietly to each person in it, I see you, I know, and I will never ever say so. The night, after all, is so fine. Let me tell you about a cap. Not a grand one, no ostrich feathers, no imported lace, nothing that would draw a second glance if you saw it lying on a chair in a London milliner's shop. Just a plain white muslin cap, the kind that any respectable woman past a certain age would wear indoors in the 1830s, with a frill around the face and a pair of ribbons tied under the chin. But the ribbons on this cap are yellow, a faded, soft, sunny yellow, the colour of old cream or late summer butter, and they're the reason I want to tell you about it, because those yellow ribbons are doing more work than any ribbon has a right to. The cap belongs, or belonged, to Miss Constance Pemberton, Miss Hatty's elder sister, who ran this household for 30 years with the force and certainty of a small weather system. Miss Constance was a woman of opinions. She had opinions about literature, and she expressed them in sentences so long and so carefully balanced that you could feel the full stops landing like gavels. She had opinions about the proper way to address a letter, the proper way to pour tea, the proper way to walk down a street. She wore a little bonnet that looked, to be perfectly honest, like a cavalry helmet crossed with a jockey's cap, and she wore it with such conviction that it became, in time, not ridiculous, but slightly magnificent, the way anything becomes magnificent if you refuse, absolutely and permanently, to be embarrassed by it. She wore a cravat, too, like a man, tied under her chin with the kind of precision that suggested she'd practiced the knot in front of a mirror until it submitted. And her letters. Miss Constance wrote letters the way a general conducts a campaign, with strategy, with economy, and with a complete refusal to waste a single inch of paper. She used words of such stately length that they filled up a page almost by themselves, and when she reached the bottom of the sheet she'd turn it sideways and write across what she'd already written, line over line, the fresh ink crossing the old until the whole page looked like a lattice of dark thread. It saved paper. It also drove Miss Hatty half mad trying to read it, because the words gathered size as they went, swelling and tangling, and by the end of a letter Miss Constance's vocabulary had grown so enormous that Miss Hatty could only guess at half of it and smile at the rest. But the letters were grand. They were magnificent, the way the helmet bonnet was magnificent. They refused on every line to be small. She's gone now. She's been gone for some years. And Miss Hatty, who spent her whole life walking 3 paces behind her sister's certainty, is alone in the house with Annie and the cat and the quiet, and the cap with yellow ribbons. Let me show you the morning. It starts early before Annie is up, in the cold bedroom at the top of the stairs. Miss Hatty sits at her dressing table, a plain dark piece of furniture with a square mirror that catches the first grey light, and begins the business of making herself ready. It isn't quick. It isn't simple. A woman of Miss Hatty's age and station doesn't just put on clothes. She builds herself, layer by careful layer, the way a mason builds a wall, and every piece has its place and its meaning. First the hair. She hasn't much of it now, it's thin and grey and fine as cobweb, but she brushes it and pins it with a patience that suggests it was once worth the trouble. And it was, if you believe her when she talks about it, which I do. She told me once, very quietly, turning a letter over in her hands as if she weren't really talking to me at all, that she'd had very pretty hair when she was young, and then she caught herself and adjusted her cap and drew herself up a little straighter in her chair, as if the memory of that pretty hair had reminded her of something she was supposed to be. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. But I noticed, and I've kept it, the way she keeps string and India rubber rings, because it seemed like something that shouldn't be thrown away. Then the cap. And this is where the day divides. Because the cap Miss Hatty reaches for first, the one her hand goes to without thinking, is the one with yellow ribbons. Here's what happens with the cap. On an ordinary morning, a morning when nobody's expected, when there's no knock to answer and no call to pay, Miss Hatty wears it. She puts it on after breakfast when she's settled into her chair by the window with her knitting or her sewing, and she wears it all morning, and it looks perfectly well on her. The ribbons are a little old-fashioned. The muslin's been washed and pressed so many times that it's gone soft as a handkerchief, but it fits, and it's comfortable, and there's something in the wearing of it, something she'd never say out loud and possibly doesn't even think in words, that keeps her sister close, as if the cap were a hand on her shoulder, as if, by wearing a thing that Constance wore, she could still be the younger sister, still have someone ahead of her, still not be the one in charge. But here is the other cap. This one is newer, stiffer, whiter. It was made by Miss Caldwell, back when Miss Caldwell was still a milliner and not yet a retired gentlewoman with an Alderney cow, and it was made specifically to look like Mrs. Blackwood's caps. Mrs. Blackwood, the Honourable Mrs. Blackwood, wears widow's caps because she is a widow, and the style of those caps is therefore not strictly appropriate for a spinster like Miss Hatty. But Miss Hatty asked for them anyway, in a quiet, roundabout way that took the milliner several minutes to decode, and Miss Caldwell, who understood perfectly but was too tactful to say so, produced something that was almost but not quite a widow's cap, close enough to be flattering, far enough to be proper. And this is the cap that Miss Hatty wears when she expects to be seen. So there is a system. The yellow ribbon cap for mornings alone, the Blackwood-style cap for afternoons with visitors, and the moment between them, the quick, flustered, heart-in-mouth moment when Miss Hatty hears a knock at the door, is one of the most important moments in her day. I was there when it happened once. We were sitting together before noon, Miss Hatty and I, and she was wearing the yellow ribbons and didn't seem to be thinking about them at all. And then Annie's voice came from downstairs and the sound of the front door, and Miss Hatty was on her feet before I'd even registered what was happening. She vanished into the back room. I heard a drawer open, the rustle of muslin, the click of a pin, and then she was back, sitting in her chair, hands folded, smiling that mild, slightly startled smile of hers, ready to receive whoever was coming up the stairs. Except that she'd forgotten to take the first cap off. She'd put the new one directly on top of the old one. 2 caps, stacked, the yellow ribbons of Miss Constance's best poking out from underneath the white frill of the imitation Blackwood. And she had no idea. She sat there, nodding and talking, with her head a good inch and a half taller than usual, and a faint halo of yellow visible around her ears, and not a soul in the room said a word. Not me, because I hadn't the heart. Not the visitor, it was Miss Caldwell as it happened, because Miss Caldwell was too deep in her own errand to notice. I keep thinking about that moment. Not the comedy of it, though it was funny in the gentlest possible way, but what it says about the architecture of Miss Hatty's life. 2 caps, 2 selves, the private self who wears her dead sister's ribbons and sits in the dark and saves candle ends and talks in her sleep about people who are gone, and the public self who puts on a stiff white cap and lights both candles and offers thin bread and butter as if she was simply a lady having tea. The speed of the switch tells you everything. It's instant. It's automatic. She doesn't think about it any more than she thinks about blinking. She just does it, the way all the women in this town do it, the way they all put on one face for the world and keep the other one folded away in a drawer like a cap with yellow ribbons that nobody's supposed to see. And Miss Caldwell, who came to call that morning, she has her own version of this, though it works differently. Miss Eliza Caldwell was a milliner. She and her older sister ran a shop in the high street for years, a proper little establishment that sold caps and bonnets and ribbons to the better families of the district. They were choosy about their customers too. Wouldn't sell to just anyone. You needed a pedigree or something close to one, or they'd send you down the street to the general shop where the man claimed everything was modelled on Queen Adelaide's latest. The Caldwell sisters dealt in truth and quality, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your bonnet had been touched by the same hands that trimmed Lady Arley's. When her sister passed on and the business closed, Miss Caldwell retired. She shut up the shop, moved the counter out, turned the downstairs into something that wasn't quite a parlour but wasn't quite a shop anymore either, and set about becoming a gentlewoman. She bought a cow, an Alderney, cream-coloured and patient, and the cow became her pride and her conversation piece, the way a garden might be for someone else or a collection of china. But here's the thing about closing a millinery shop. You don't throw the stock away. Miss Caldwell had bonnets, she had caps, she had ribbons in colours that had been fashionable when King William was alive but weren't strictly current anymore. Emerald greens and deep plums and golds that had faded to amber, and she wore them, all of them. Slowly, carefully, one by one, she wore out the inventory of her former trade. A bonnet that would have looked daring in a London drawing room 5 years earlier sat on Miss Caldwell's head in Wenbury as if it had been born there. Ribbons that would have made a younger woman look like she was trying too hard simply made Miss Caldwell look like herself. A woman who happened to own a great many ribbons and saw no reason not to use them. And nobody minded. That's the beautiful part. In any other town, a woman wearing fashions half a decade out of date would draw comment or pity, or the particular kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. But Wenbury isn't any other town. Fashion arrives here late and leaves slowly, like a guest who's been offered a second cup of tea. The London styles drift north along the coaching roads, and arrive in the high street shop windows already softened by distance, and by the time the ladies of Wenbury have considered them, debated them, and cautiously adopted them, another year has passed and London has moved on to something else entirely. So Miss Caldwell's old stock doesn't look old here. It just looks like Miss Caldwell. And then there's the calash. I should tell you about the calash because if you've never seen one, you're missing one of the stranger sights in English headwear. A calash is a folding hood, a large, stiffened, collapsible contraption made of silk stretched over hoops of cane or whalebone, designed to be worn over a cap when a lady goes outdoors, protecting both the cap and the hair underneath from wind and weather. When it's up, it looks remarkably like the folding top of an old-fashioned carriage. When it's down, it collapses flat against the back of the head, and the lady looks more or less normal. But when it's up, and in Wenbury it is always up, because the wind blows and the rain falls and caps are too valuable to risk, the effect is startling. Imagine a woman's face peering out from inside a small fabric tunnel. Imagine the tunnel is slightly too large for the face. Imagine the whole assembly moving down a cobblestone street on a pair of wooden pattens, swaying gently like a ship under sail. The children of Wenbury are terrified of them. I don't blame the children. On a dark evening, when 3 or 4 ladies are walking together to a party, their calashes bobbing and swaying in the lantern light, they look like nothing so much as a procession of very large, very dignified beetles making their way slowly across a kitchen floor. The children stop their games and stare, and the ladies sweep past without a glance, because a lady in a calash does not acknowledge that she looks unusual. A lady in a calash looks exactly as a lady ought to look, and if a child should point, or whisper, or, God forbid, laugh, that child's mother would hear about it before sundown because Miss Finch would make certain of it. There's something I can't quite let go of about all of this. The caps, the bonnets, the ribbons, the calashes, the whole careful architecture of what goes on a woman's head in Wenbury. It isn't vanity. If it were vanity, it would be easier to understand and easier to dismiss. Vanity wants to be admired. What these women want is simply to be correct, to be recognisable, to walk out of their front doors looking like the kind of person they believe themselves to be, even when the mirror and the wardrobe and the dwindling income are all conspiring to suggest otherwise. And so they mend, they alter, they pick old ribbons off old bonnets and stitch them onto new shapes, and they wash muslin until it's as soft as skin, and they wear things that were fashionable years ago and pretend they're wearing them by choice. And in a way they are. Because the choice isn't between this bonnet and a better one. The choice is between this bonnet and giving up. And not one of them. Not Miss Hatty with her yellow ribbons. Not Miss Caldwell with her retired inventory. Not Mrs. Thornbury with her single good shawl that she saves for Sundays and Wednesdays. Not one of them has ever chosen giving up. Every stitch is a small act of refusal. Every pin is a vote cast against the idea that a woman with a thin income and a cold parlour and a cap that's been washed 40 times is somehow less than she was. And the calash, ridiculous as it looks from the outside, is the armour they wear to step beyond the front door and into a world that might, if they let it, make them feel small. But underneath the calash, underneath the bonnet, underneath the cap, whether it's the one with yellow ribbons or the one modelled on Mrs. Blackwood's or the one left over from a milliner's closing sale, there's just a woman, getting older, getting colder, tying the same ribbon she tied yesterday, pinning the same pins, smoothing the same muslin. And it matters to her. It matters more than you might think, this daily act of putting on the right cap, the right face, the right self. Because the cap isn't just a cap. It's a declaration. It says, I am still here. I am still a lady. I am still worth looking at, even if only by the cat in the parlour fire and the woman in the next chair who is wearing her own version of the same quiet armour. Miss Hatty is dressed now. The yellow ribbons are put away. The good cap is on, the pins are straight, and she's ready for whatever the day brings next. Which, in Wenbury, is almost certainly a knock at the door. And now, the knock comes. It's late morning, not quite noon, which matters, because noon is the earliest acceptable hour for a call in Wenbury, and the knock has come at 1:45. Miss Hatty hears it, and her hands stop moving on the knitting. A small crease appears between her eyebrows. She glances at the clock on the mantelpiece, a pretty old-fashioned clock with a painted face that hasn't kept reliable time in years, but whose general sense of the hour can be trusted. 11:45, someone is early, and being early in Wenbury is almost as grave an offence as being late. But she's ready. The good cap is on, the yellow ribbons are safely in the drawer. Annie's footsteps are already on the stairs, heavy and hurried, and in a moment she's at the parlour door, slightly out of breath, announcing that Miss Caldwell has come to call. And Miss Hatty nods and smooths her skirt and says, "Do show her up, Annie," in a voice so calm you'd think she received callers at irregular hours every day of her life, which she does not. Irregular hours are, in Wenbury, a kind of emergency. Miss Caldwell appears in the doorway, flushed, a little breathless, her best bonnet on, one of the old stock-in-trade ones, plum-coloured, with a ribbon that was fashionable when the king was alive. And before she's even sat down, before she's even taken off her gloves, she's apologising. The apologies pour out of her like water from a kettle. She knows the hour is unusual. She wouldn't dream of calling so early if it weren't a matter of some importance. She begs Miss Hatty to forgive the presumption. She hopes she hasn't interrupted. She's terribly sorry for the liberty, and would Miss Hatty believe that she almost turned around at the gate twice because she felt so dreadful about the timing. Miss Hatty listens to all of this with a gentle, patient, encouraging expression, the way you'd listen to a child explaining why the biscuit tin is empty. She says it's perfectly all right. She says she was only knitting. She says nothing at all about the 11:45, because pointing it out would be worse than the offence itself, and Miss Hatty is a woman who understands that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is pretend that nothing unusual has happened. And then, at last, after several more layers of apology and a brief digression about the weather, Miss Caldwell gets to the point. She'd like to invite Miss Hatty to tea at her house next Tuesday. This is, and I want you to understand the weight of this, a significant event. Tea at Miss Caldwell's house is not a casual affair. Miss Caldwell doesn't entertain often, and when she does, it's with the full force of her ambition and her anxiety, both of which are considerable. She's a former milliner. Her father was a clerk. She has spent the years since her retirement building, brick by careful brick, the identity of a gentlewoman, and every social occasion she hosts is a test. A chance to prove that she belongs in the parlours of Wenbury, and not behind a counter. The stakes, for Miss Caldwell, are as high as they come, and the invitation list is her battlefield. She's invited Mrs. Blackwood first. This is correct. Mrs. Blackwood is the highest-ranking woman in Wenbury, and therefore must be asked before anyone else. Miss Caldwell tells this to Miss Hatty, with a mixture of pride and terror, as if she's just been granted an audience with the Queen and is worried about tripping on the carpet. Mrs. Blackwood has most kindly and condescendingly agreed to come. She has made one small request, that she be allowed to bring Carlo, her dog. Miss Caldwell, who I suspect has no particular feeling about dogs one way or the other, told Mrs. Blackwood that if she had a weakness in the world, it was for dogs. And now, Miss Hatty, the rector's daughter. Second in the hierarchy, after the Honourable Mrs. Blackwood, but first among equals in terms of true gentility, because a rector's daughter is born into her station, while Mrs. Blackwood merely married into hers. Miss Caldwell is careful to note this. She couldn't possibly have thought of asking Miss Hatty until she had first secured Mrs. Blackwood, because that would have been presumptuous. But neither could she have left Miss Hatty out, because that would have been unthinkable. The order matters. Everything matters. Miss Hatty asks about Miss Finch. Will she be there? This is a practical question, not a social one. Miss Hatty's thinking about the card table, and whether there'll be enough players for preference, and whether Carlo the dog can be counted as a partner. Miss Caldwell assures her that Miss Finch is next on the list. She was going to call on her this very afternoon. And Mrs. Thornbury? Of course. Miss Caldwell was planning to visit her before Miss Finch, in fact. Although Mrs. Thornbury's circumstances have changed, she lives in a room the size of a nursery with one small servant. She was born in Ashford, and allied by marriage to the Tyrrell family, and one can never forget an alliance to the Tyrrells. Miss Hatty cares less about the Tyrrells than about whether Mrs. Thornbury can hear well enough to play cards, but she nods approvingly. And then Miss Hatty asks the question that changes the temperature of the room. A Mrs. Fitzadam, I suppose? Miss Caldwell's face does something complicated. Her lips purse, her chin lifts, her hands, which had been fidgeting with her gloves, go very still, and then, with a dignity that seems to come from somewhere deeper than her bonnet and her retired milliner's pride, she says, "No, not Mrs. Fitzadam. She has the greatest respect for Mrs. Fitzadam," she says, "but she cannot think her fit company for ladies of Mrs. Blackwood's and Miss Hatty's standing. A line must be drawn somewhere, and there it is, the line, the invisible, undrawn, absolutely rigid line that runs through the middle of Wenbury's social world like a wall through a garden. On one side, the ladies who have always been ladies, by birth, by marriage, by the accident of a rector father or an earl's brother-in-law. On the other side, the people who used to be something else, and Miss Caldwell, who used to be a milliner, who used to stand behind a counter and sell ribbons to the women who now sit in her parlour as guests, has somehow crossed that line. She's on the right side of it now, with her Alderney cow and her retired gentility. But she hasn't forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side, and so she guards the line more fiercely than anyone, because she knows, better than anyone, how thin it is. There's something that won't quite leave me about this. The question of Mrs. Fitzadam. Her name, to begin with. Fitzadam. In Wenbury, this name is the subject of an ongoing low-level fascination that functions as a kind of social detective work. The word Fitz, you see, has connotations. It means child of in the old Norman French, and it appears in some very distinguished surnames. Fitzroy, for instance, which was the name given to royal children born outside of marriage, and Fitzclarence. Those were King William IV's natural children. So the prefix Fitz carries a whiff of aristocratic scandal, a hint of noble blood running through unofficial channels. And Mrs. Fitzadam, who was born plain Mary Hoggins, the daughter of respectable farming people, whose brother is the town doctor, a decent man with an unfortunate surname that sounds, as Miss Constance once put it, coarse. Mrs. Fitzadam has acquired through marriage a name that makes the ladies of Wenbury squint and wonder. Mrs. Thornbury, who is the gentlest and most credulous of the lot, once sat at tea and worked out to her own complete satisfaction that Fitzadam probably meant child of Adam, and that nobody without genuine breeding would have the nerve to carry such a prefix. She supported this theory with a long winding anecdote about a cousin who spelled his name with 2 small f's instead of a capital, Fulks, and who looked down on capital letters as the mark of recently invented families. This cousin, she said, was so particular about breeding that he nearly remained a bachelor until he met a widow named Farringdon at a watering place and married her on the spot entirely on the strength of her 2 small f's. I don't know what to do with this story, honestly. I don't know whether to be charmed or exhausted by the idea of a man falling in love with a piece of punctuation. But I'll tell you what it tells me about Wenbury. These women live inside language the way a fish lives inside water. Every word, every syllable, every letter of every name is inspected, weighed, turned over, held up to the light, and measured against a standard that exists nowhere, except in the collective imagination of a dozen women, sitting in small parlours, drinking tea from translucent cups. The name is the thing, the name is the person, and if your name is Hoggins, you had better hope your husband's name was something grander, or you'll spend the rest of your life curtsying to a woman who has decided not to see you. Because that's what Mrs. Blackwood does. She doesn't refuse to speak to Mrs. Fitzadam. That would be rude, and rudeness is vulgar. She simply doesn't see her. At parties, in rooms that hold no more than 8 or 10 women, Mrs. Fitzadam will stand up when Mrs. Blackwood enters and curtsy deeply. So deeply that her knees must ache from it. And Mrs. Blackwood will gaze at the wall just above her head with an expression of benign blankness, as if the space where Mrs. Fitzadam is standing contains nothing but air. It isn't cruelty, exactly. It's something more practised than cruelty. It's the art of selective blindness, perfected over years, applied with the steady precision of someone who has decided once and for all where the edges of her world are and who stands inside them. But Miss Hatty cares about the cards. That's what I love about her. In the middle of all this, the Fitz and the Hoggins and the 2 small f's and the curtsying and the blindness, Miss Hatty is thinking about preference. She's thinking about whether there'll be 4 for a table, and who'll be the unlucky one stuck with cribbage, and whether Carlo will sit on the good chair again. She lives inside the system, she follows its rules, she knows exactly where Mrs. Fitzadam stands and why, but at the end of the day what she really wants is a decent hand of cards and a cup of tea that's hot enough and a biscuit that isn't stale. And the visit is ending. The 15 minutes, because it is always 15 minutes, never more, are almost up. Miss Caldwell is gathering her gloves, retying her bonnet, preparing to leave with the same elaborate ceremony with which she arrived. There will be more apologies, there will be thanks, there will be a final agonised mention of the early hour and a last plea for forgiveness. And Miss Hatty will say again that it was no trouble at all, and that she's looking forward to Tuesday, and that Miss Caldwell really mustn't worry. I should tell you about those 15 minutes because they're not just a habit. They're a law. An unwritten, unbreakable, utterly rigid law that governs every call paid in Wenbury, and the precision with which it's observed would make a Swiss clockmaker weep with admiration. You arrive. You sit. You are offered tea, which you may accept or decline depending on the time of day and the state of your hostess's supplies. You talk, and then, After a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes, no more, no less, you stand, you smooth your skirt, you reach for your gloves, and you leave. What do you talk about for 15 minutes? This is the art. Because the list of subjects you can't mention is so long and so precise that what remains is a narrow, well-worn channel through which conversation flows like water in a mill race. Fast, shallow, and always in the same direction. You can talk about the weather, though not in a way that suggests it's affecting your plans. You can talk about health, but only in the most general terms. I trust you are well is acceptable. Anything more specific enters the territory of the body, which is vulgar. You can talk about mutual acquaintances, but only to report their movements, not their opinions. You can talk about recent events in Wenbury, but only the approved ones. A new shop, a change of landlord, a rumour of a visitor at one of the better houses. And you can talk about your handwork. Knitting, crochet, embroidery. These are inexhaustible subjects, and many a Wenbury call has been carried entirely on the backs of a new stitch pattern and a disagreement about the proper tension for Shetland wool. What you cannot talk about: money, illness in detail, anything that has happened in London unless it involves royalty, anything political, anything theological, unless it's limited to praise of the sermon, which is expected but must be vague. The cost of anything, the income of anyone, the reason why any particular person was or was not invited to any particular gathering, and above all anything that might cause your hostess to feel that you have noticed the thinness of her bread, the coldness of her parlour, or the absence of a second servant. And then there's the return visit, within 3 days. This is not optional. If Miss Caldwell calls on Miss Hatty on a Thursday, Miss Hatty must call on Miss Caldwell by Sunday, not Monday. That would be late, and lateness is a kind of insult suggesting that the original call wasn't important enough to return promptly. Not the same afternoon. That would be over-eager, and over-eagerness is vulgar. Somewhere in the window of 3 days, at the correct hour, wearing the correct cap, Miss Hatty will present herself at Miss Caldwell's door, and the whole ritual will begin again. The same chair, the same topics, the same 15 minutes, the same careful, measured, perfectly timed dance of two women pretending that dropping in on each other is the easiest, most effortless act imaginable, when in fact it's as choreographed as a court masque. You know what I think about sometimes, lying awake in this quiet town? I think about how much of these women's lives is given over to the ritual of calling, not to friendship, though friendship lives inside it, the way a seed lives inside a shell. Not to pleasure, though there's pleasure in it, the small, deep pleasure of being known and visited and expected, but to the ritual itself, the getting dressed, the walking there, the sitting down, the 15 minutes, the walking back, the noting of the call in the mental ledger that every woman in Wenbury keeps, where debts of visitation are as carefully tracked as debts of money, and to fall behind on your calls is to fall behind on your place in the world. It's a kind of work, is what it is. Unpaid, unacknowledged, invisible work, as steady and demanding as any trade. And the women who do it, who have done it for decades, who will go on doing it until they can no longer walk to each other's doors, don't think of it as work. They think of it as life, as what you do, as the way things are. And maybe they're right. Maybe the ritual is the friendship, in the same way that the cap is the woman, and the thin bread is the feast, and the walk to party is the night that's so fine. Maybe the form and the feeling have grown together so completely that you can't separate them anymore without damaging both. And then Miss Caldwell will be gone, and the parlour will be quiet again, and Miss Hatty will pick up her knitting, and Annie will come up to ask if she wants more tea, and the clock with the painted face will tick on toward noon, which is the hour when the day officially begins and all the other calls can start. Because this is what a morning in Wenbury looks like. A cap changed, a knock answered, an invitation delivered with enough apologies to fill a cathedral, a name discussed, a line drawn, a dog accommodated, and underneath all of it, steady as a heartbeat, the agreement, the unspoken, unbroken, iron-strong agreement that everyone is exactly who they say they are, and nobody is anything less. The knitting needles click, the clock ticks, and somewhere across town Miss Caldwell is already climbing Mrs. Thornbury's front step, rehearsing a fresh set of apologies for the woman who was born a Tyrrell and married an Ashford, and must therefore be asked before Miss Finch, who has no such connections, but who always knows everything first. Mrs. Adelaide Thornbury lives in a house that is, by any honest measurement, not much larger than a cupboard. I say this with affection because Mrs. Thornbury herself would say it with none. She'd never say it at all, in fact, because acknowledging the size of your house is the same as acknowledging why it's that size. And why is a door that Mrs. Thornbury has bolted shut from the inside and wallpapered over and arranged a small chair in front of so that nobody can find it? But the house is tiny. There's no getting around it. The parlour, which doubles as the dining room and the drawing room and the room where everything happens, is so small that when 4 women sit in it, they can all reach the fire without leaving their chairs. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man, not that there are tall men in Wenbury or short ones or any men at all really, would have to duck at the doorway, and the single window looks out onto a yard the size of a tablecloth, where a line of washing hangs on Mondays and a cat sits on Wednesdays, and nothing at all happens on the other 5 days of the week. But Mrs. Thornbury gives parties, and this is the miracle of her, the small, quiet, magnificent miracle that I want to tell you about, because it says more about the spirit of Wenbury than anything else I know. She was born in Ashford. This matters, because it means that somewhere in her past there were large rooms and wide stairs, and servants who came when you rang, and a garden with actual flowers in it, not just a yard with a cat. She married a Thornbury, who was connected by some winding genealogical path to the Tyrrell family, and this connection, tenuous as an old cobweb, gives her a certain standing in Wenbury that has nothing to do with the size of her parlour, and everything to do with the length of her pedigree. She's a widow, she's kind, she's gentle, she's deaf, considerably deaf in fact, which makes conversation at her parties a curious business of raised voices and missed connections and sentences that arrive at her ear several seconds after they've left your mouth, by which time the subject has moved on, and she's answering a question nobody asked. And she has one servant. One, a girl from the charity school, young, small, round-armed, with the bewildered look of someone who has been placed in a situation she doesn't entirely understand, and is doing her best with the materials available. The girl can't be more than 14. Her arms are short. This will become important. Let me bring you into the parlour on a party afternoon. The fire has been built up. Mrs. Thornbury is generous with coal when she has guests, which is itself a kind of extravagance, a declaration that today is not an ordinary day. The chairs have been arranged in a careful semicircle, close enough to the fire for warmth, far enough from each other for dignity. There's a small table with a cloth on it, and on the cloth there are cups. Thin, translucent, beautiful cups. The kind that have been in the family for decades and are washed by hand with a tenderness usually reserved for infants. Everything is clean, everything is polished, everything is in its place. And underneath the sofa, invisible unless you happen to be sitting on the floor, which you would not be because you are a lady, is the tea tray. The tray is there because there's nowhere else to put it. The kitchen, if you can call it a kitchen, it's really just a corner of the back room with a range and a shelf, is too far away and too awkward for the charity school girl to carry a loaded tray without incident. The stairs are narrow, the passageway is dark, so the tray has been prepared in advance, loaded with everything it needs. The teapot, the sugar, the milk, the thin bread and butter, the sponge biscuits, the little pot of jam, and slid beneath the sofa like a drawer into a cabinet. And there it waits, out of sight, while the guests arrive and settle and begin the slow, comfortable business of talking about nothing in particular. And then, at the appointed moment, the girl appears. She comes in from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, her face slightly flushed, her expression somewhere between determination and panic. She crosses the room, she kneels beside the sofa, and then, with the guests still talking, still sipping, still pretending that nothing unusual is happening, she reaches underneath and begins to pull. The tray doesn't come easily, the sofa is low, the tray is heavy, and the girl's arms, those short, round, charity school arms, aren't quite long enough to get a proper grip. She tugs, she wiggles, she braces one knee against the sofa leg and pulls with both hands. The cups rattle, the teaspoons clink, a small wave of milk sloshes in the jug, and the ladies on the sofa, Miss Hatty, Miss Finch, whoever else is sitting there, shift their weight slightly, lift their feet a fraction, lean gently to one side, all without looking down, all without acknowledging that the furniture beneath them is currently being disassembled by a 14-year-old on her hands and knees, and Mrs. Thornbury sits in her chair by the fire, presiding over all of this with a smile of serene, magnificent ignorance. She doesn't know what's on the tray. She couldn't possibly know, because she has a servants' hall where such things are decided, and a housekeeper who manages the kitchen, and a cook who prepares the food, and the lady of the house does not concern herself with these details. She simply receives the tray when it appears, and expresses a mild, delighted surprise at whatever happens to be on it. "Oh, how lovely," she'll say, peering at the sponge biscuits as if she's seeing them for the first time. "What a treat." The food itself deserves a moment because Mrs. Thornbury has put thought into it. More thought than she'd ever admit. More thought than the small quantities would suggest. The bread is cut in careful triangles, each one thin enough to read through but uniform in size, which takes practice and a sharp knife and a steady hand. The butter is spread so evenly you'd think it had been applied with a ruler. The sponge biscuits are golden topped and light, the kind that crumble when you bite them and leave a faint taste of vanilla and egg on your tongue. And the jam, damson, dark as claret, sits in a small white dish with a silver spoon that Mrs. Thornbury polishes every Tuesday, whether she's expecting company or not, because you never know. A woman should always be ready for guests, even a woman who hasn't had a guest in 3 weeks. And the tea. The tea is strong and hot and good. I want to say this clearly because it matters. Mrs. Thornbury may economise on candles and coal and bread and nearly everything else in her life, but she doesn't economise on tea. The pot is full, the leaves are fresh, and the water was boiling. Properly boiling, not the half-hearted simmer that some people mistake for a boil. When it went in, a woman can bear many things, but weak tea is not among them. And so, the one true luxury in Mrs. Thornbury's house is the thing that nobody notices, because it's the thing she never lets fall below standard. And here is the part that I come back to, over and over, like a tongue returning to a loose tooth. She knows. She knows what's on the tray because she made it. She was in that tiny kitchen at 6 o'clock this morning, before the charity school girl arrived, mixing the batter for the sponge biscuits and cutting the bread so thin you could read a letter through it. She mixed the sugar into the butter with a wooden spoon, and she watched the biscuits through the oven door, and she arranged them on the tray with the particular care of a woman who has very little and wants it to look like enough. She carried the tray into the parlour herself because the girl wasn't there yet, and she slid it under the sofa with her own hands, and then she went upstairs and changed into her good dress and came back down and sat in her chair and waited for her guests. And when they arrived, she was the lady of the house who doesn't know what's in the kitchen. And we know. Every woman in that room knows. We know because we do the same thing in our own houses with our own trays, our own thin bread, our own single servants or no servants at all. We know because we can see the flour on her cuffs that she didn't quite brush off, and the slight redness on her hands from the hot oven, and the way the biscuits are arranged in exactly the pattern she always uses, which is the pattern her mother used, which is the pattern of a woman who has done this herself and not left it to a cook. We know, and she knows that we know, and we know that she knows that we know, and not one of us, not one single woman in that room, will ever say a word about it. I keep coming back to this layered knowing, this Russian doll of mutual awareness wrapped in mutual silence. It's the most Wenbury thing I can think of. More than the candles, more than the calashes, more than the walk to parties and the thin bread and the whole elaborate architecture of elegant economy. Because this isn't just pretending. This is something deeper. This is a room full of women who have each agreed, independently and simultaneously, to maintain a fiction that none of them believes, for the sake of a woman they all love, so that she can sit in her chair by the fire and be the person she was before the money ran out, and the big house went and the servants left and the world shrank down to the size of this parlour. And they do it beautifully. They talk about household management as if Mrs. Thornbury's household requires managing. They discuss the proper way to instruct a housekeeper, the proper ratio of servants to rooms, the difficulty of finding good help in the country, and Mrs. Thornbury nods along, deaf to half of it, but catching enough to agree, and nobody looks at the charity school girl kneeling by the sofa with her arms under the cushions, because looking would be the same as saying, and saying would be the same as seeing, and seeing would break the spell. There's a kind of love in this that doesn't have a name, I think. It isn't friendship exactly, though these women have been friends for 30 years. It isn't pity, because pity would be condescending, and condescension is vulgar. It isn't charity, because charity implies a giver and a receiver, and in this room everyone is giving and everyone is receiving and nobody is keeping score. What it is, I think, is recognition. Each woman in that parlour sees herself in Mrs. Thornbury. Each one knows that the distance between her own life and this one This life in a room the size of a nursery with one servant and a tray under the sofa is measured not in miles but in pennies, and that pennies have a way of disappearing when you're not watching. And so they eat the biscuits, they drink the tea, they praise the bread and butter, which is excellent, they say, truly excellent, the best they've had in weeks. And Mrs. Thornbury glows. She actually glows. Her cheeks go pink with pleasure, and she leans forward in her chair, and her deaf old ears seem to catch every word of the compliment, even though they miss half of everything else. And for a moment, just a moment, she's the woman she used to be, in the big house, with the wide stairs and the servants and the garden. She's giving a party, a real party, and her guests are happy. The girl collects the cups afterwards. She does it quietly, stacking them on the tray with the careful concentration of someone who knows that each cup is worth more than a week of her wages, and that breaking one would be a catastrophe beyond imagination. Mrs. Thornbury watches her from the corner of her eye. She always watches, though she pretends not to. And when the girl has safely navigated the tray back under the sofa, Mrs. Thornbury exhales. You wouldn't see it unless you were looking. Just a small breath, a tiny release of tension, like a woman who has been holding a fragile thing and has finally set it down. The fire crackles. The conversation drifts to knitting, Mrs. Thornbury's current project, a pair of stockings in a complicated pattern that she follows by touch, because her eyes aren't what they were. Miss Finch disagrees with her about the correct way to turn a heel, and because Mrs. Thornbury is deaf and Miss Finch is sharp-tongued, the disagreement escalates into a slow, gentle, entirely one-sided argument in which Miss Finch becomes increasingly specific and Mrs. Thornbury becomes increasingly agreeable, each woman convinced she's winning. Miss Hatty sits between them, smiling at both, saying nothing, content to let the argument wash over her like warm water, and I sit in my corner watching the firelight on the thin cups, watching the girl's small hands as she slides the tray out of sight, watching Mrs. Thornbury's face as she leans toward Miss Finch and says with absolute sincerity that she's sure Miss Finch is right about the heel, though she herself has always done it the other way, and her mother did it the other way, and her grandmother did it the other way, and she's not sure she could learn a new method at her age, but she does so admire Miss Finch's adventurous spirit. There's something about this room, this tiny, warm, firelit room, with the tray under the sofa, and the cups that let the light through, and the deaf old woman presiding over it all with the grace of a duchess and the budget of a scullery maid, that makes me want to stay forever. Not because it's comfortable, though it is. Not because the company's brilliant, though they're kind, but because it's real. Underneath all the pretending, underneath the fiction of the servants' hall and the housekeeper and the cook, underneath the layers of knowing and not saying, what's actually happening here is very simple. A woman with almost nothing has opened her door and shared what she has, and the people who came through that door have received it as if it were everything. And maybe it is. Maybe a sponge biscuit baked at 6 a.m. by a woman who can barely afford the flour is worth more than a banquet. Maybe a cup of tea poured from a pot that's been warming under a sofa is the finest tea in England. Maybe the whole point of elegant economy isn't the economy at all, it's the elegance. The insistence, against all evidence, that this is enough, that this is good, that a life lived in a room the size of a nursery, with one servant and a cat in the yard and a fire that's been built up specially, is a life worth celebrating. The afternoon light is fading now, the fire is burning low, and the guests are reaching for their gloves because it's nearly time to go, nearly time to walk home through the quiet streets in pattens and calashes, to their own small houses, their own thin bread, their own single candles. But not yet. Not quite yet. There's still a little warmth left in the room, and a little tea left in the pot, and Mrs. Thornbury is telling a story about her late husband's aunt, who once met a duchess at a watering place, and nobody wants to be the first to leave, so they stay, just a few minutes more, just until the story's done. There's a carpet in this story that I haven't told you about yet, and I think it's time, because the carpet explains something important about the way Miss Hatty's mind works. The way all their minds work, really. These women who've turned thrift into a kind of religion and made its practice as automatic as prayer. The carpet was Miss Constance's doing. She bought it for the drawing room, a proper Turkey carpet in deep reds and blues, and the day it was laid down you'd have thought a new monarch had been crowned. The house smelled of wool and dye for a week. The colours were rich and dense and beautiful. The kind of carpet that made you feel, just by standing on it, that you were somebody. And from the moment it was unrolled, Miss Constance declared war on the sun. Because the sun, you see, fades carpets. Everyone knows this, but for Miss Constance it wasn't a fact. It was a personal affront. She couldn't put up blinds, because blinds cost money, and besides, the windows let in the only decent light the room had. So instead, every afternoon, when the sun came slanting through the front window and fell in a long golden rectangle on the floor, Miss Hatty and I would get down on our hands and knees with sheets of old newspaper and cover the bright patch. We'd spread the paper carefully, weighting the edges with books, and then we'd sit down again and pick up our work. And in 15 minutes, the sun would have shifted, and a bright new rectangle would be burning on an uncovered spot of carpet, and down we'd go again, shuffling the newspapers along, chasing the sunlight across the floor like two women herding a golden cat. We did this every afternoon, every single afternoon, all summer long. Miss Constance would sit very upright in her chair, knitting or reading, and call out directions without looking up. "It's moved, Charlotte. To the left. No, further. There." And I'd scramble across the floor with an armload of newspaper, shifting the coverage, patching the gaps, trying to stay ahead of a star that moved faster than I expected and didn't care at all about turkey carpets. And here's what I want you to understand about this. It wasn't miserable. It wasn't grim or joyless or sad. It was, in its own peculiar way, rather companionable. There we were, two women in a quiet room on a summer afternoon, engaged in a task that was completely absurd and completely necessary. And after a while the absurdity faded, and it was just something we did together, like knitting or talking or drinking tea. The sun moved, the newspapers moved, Miss Constance's needles clicked, and the carpet stayed beautiful, year after year after year, its colours as deep and true as the day it was laid, because two women had spent every summer afternoon on their hands and knees, protecting it from the only enemy they couldn't lock out. I think about that sometimes, about the patience it took, about the stubbornness, about the quiet, daily, unglamorous commitment to a thing that most people would have let fade and called it natural wear. Miss Constance didn't accept natural wear. She didn't accept the idea that beautiful things had to become less beautiful just because time passed and the sun came through the window. And maybe that's what all of this is about, really. All the candles and the caps and the calashes and the newspaper paths. Not just saving money, but refusing to let the world take things away from you without a fight. And the carpet stayed beautiful. It's still beautiful now, though Miss Constance is gone and nobody chases the sunbeams anymore, and the edges have softened to a gentler shade of red. It's the most expensive thing in the house, that carpet. The most valuable object Miss Hatty owns, and it cost Miss Constance nothing but time. But the newspapers had another duty, and this one was even stranger. Before Miss Constance's evening parties, those solemn, careful, card-playing affairs with thin bread and threepenny steaks, she would spend an entire morning cutting and stitching pieces of newspaper together to make little paths. Paper paths leading from the front door to each chair in the drawing room, so that the guests could walk from entrance to seat without their shoes touching the carpet. The paths were laid out like roads on a map, a main avenue from the door, branching off to the left and right at each chair, and they were stitched together with thread so they wouldn't shift underfoot. The guests walked in their pattens and their muddy boots, and they followed the paper paths to their places, and the carpet beneath remained untouched. I think about those paper paths sometimes, about a woman who would spend a morning with scissors and thread and old copies of the county newspaper, cutting and stitching a highway system across her own parlour floor to protect a thing she couldn't afford to replace, about the guests who walked along those paths without a word of surprise or comment, as if paper roads were the most ordinary thing in the world, about the way the newspaper print would be upside down and sideways, and you'd catch fragments of livestock prices and county court proceedings as you made your way to your chair, and nobody would mention that either, because mentioning it would mean noticing it, and noticing it would mean asking why. And why leads to money, and money is the word that must not be spoken. But the oranges. Let me tell you about the oranges, because they're the thing I come back to most often. The thing that makes me laugh and ache at the same time. Oranges in Wenbury are a seasonal luxury. They arrive in winter, bright and strange and smelling of somewhere warm, and they sit in the fruit dish on the dining table like small imported suns. And the proper way to eat an orange, as Miss Constance established long ago, is not to cut it. Cutting, she explained, was wasteful. The juice runs out when you cut. It goes everywhere, onto the plate, onto the tablecloth, onto your hands, and then it's lost. Nobody knows where it goes. It simply vanishes, and the orange is diminished, and the whole exercise has been a kind of leaking disaster from start to finish. The correct method, the only method, according to Miss Constance, though I think she used a longer, more Latin-sounding word for it, is to suck the orange. You pierce a small hole in the skin, and you put the orange to your lips, and you draw out the juice slowly, steadily, wasting nothing. Every drop is accounted for. The orange gives up its sweetness in an orderly fashion, under controlled conditions, and when you're done the skin is light and dry and empty, like a little leather purse. But here's the problem. Sucking an orange is, well, let me put it this way. It involves a certain facial expression, a certain sound, a certain intimacy between mouth and fruit that is, in the collective opinion of the ladies of Wenbury, not suitable for public display. It resembles, Miss Constance once observed with a delicate shudder, a ceremony more commonly associated with very small babies. And so a compromise was reached, silently, permanently, as all the best compromises in Wenbury are. After dessert, when the oranges came out, Miss Constance and Miss Hatty would rise from the table. They wouldn't say anything. They'd simply stand, each of them reaching for an orange from the dish without quite looking at each other, and then they'd withdraw. Miss Constance to her room upstairs, Miss Hatty to hers. And behind two closed doors in two separate bedrooms, two grown women would sit alone and eat their oranges the only way that worked, in the private dark where nobody could see and nobody could judge and nobody could connect the gentle, refined ladies of the rectory with the very ungenteel sound of sucking. I tried once, after Miss Constance was gone and it was just Miss Hatty and me, to persuade her to stay. I said I'd hold up a book so I couldn't see. I said I wouldn't look. I said she could make whatever noise she liked and I'd pretend I was deaf. But Miss Hatty was horrified, truly horrified. Not at the thought of being seen, I think she'd have managed that, but at the thought of breaking the rule. Miss Constance's rule. The rule that said oranges are eaten alone in private behind a closed door, and that's the way things are done in this house. And so Miss Hatty rose from the table, took her orange, and went upstairs. And I sat alone in the dining room, eating mine with a knife and fork like a barbarian, with the juice running everywhere. And I thought about how strange it is that a piece of fruit can carry the weight of a whole way of life. But you know what? I also thought about the orange itself, about what it must have been like in a small, cold, northern English town in the middle of winter, to hold a thing like that in your hands, something warm-coloured, something that smelled of groves and sun and a world beyond the rain. Miss Hatty's hands are always cold. She doesn't complain about it, because complaining would be vulgar, but I've felt them when she passes me a cup or a needle, and they're like small stones from a riverbed. And to hold an orange in those cold hands, to feel the dimpled skin under your thumbs, to press your nail into it and release that bright, sharp, stinging scent, I think that must be a kind of private joy so intense that she's right to take it behind a closed door. Some pleasures are too real for company. And then there's the question of dessert. Not dessert in the modern sense. Not pudding, not sweets, not the final course of a meal as you or I would understand it. Dessert in Wenbury means something very specific. It means the small, formal arrangement of fruit and biscuits and wine that appears on the table after dinner, and it is governed by rules as strict as any in the church liturgy. Here is how it works. The table is set with 2 wine glasses per person, always 2, even if nobody drinks more than half a glass. The glasses stand empty and gleaming, sentinels of propriety. At the top of the table sits a dish of fruit, gooseberries usually, or currants, or whatever Miss Constance gathered from the garden in summer and stored away for winter use. The fruit is not fresh. It hasn't been fresh for months. The gooseberries were picked early and dried on the window ledge, and the currants were stripped from the bushes while they were still hard, and the whole collection was kept in a stone jar in the pantry until it was needed. I sometimes thought they'd have tasted better eaten straight from the branch in July. But as Miss Constance pointed out, if you ate everything fresh from the garden, there'd be nothing left for dessert in winter, and a house without dessert is a house without standards. So the dried gooseberries sit at the top, hard and slightly wrinkled, like tiny elderly faces. The currants and biscuits go at the sides, and at the bottom of the table, ceremonially, sit the 2 decanters. The decanters are beautiful, cut glass, heavy with silver labels on fine chains, and they catch the candlelight and throw little splinters of colour across the cloth. They look like wealth. They look like a household where wine flows freely and is replaced without thought. But you and I know better by now, don't we? The decanters are filled only for parties. Between parties they sit on the sideboard with whatever's left in them from last time. A finger's depth of claret turning slowly to vinegar, waiting for the next occasion when it can be topped up with something fresher and sent back into the world. And here is a thing I've noticed, a thing that nobody talks about, and that I've only worked out by watching. The wine in those decanters is, by the time it reaches a glass, a kind of archaeological record. The bottom layer is from 2 Christmases ago. The middle layer is from last spring's card party. The top layer is from last month when a visitor came and had to be properly received. Each layer sits on the one below it, and they don't quite mix, and the colour shifts from dark to light as you pour. And the taste, well, the taste is something that you wouldn't choose if you had a choice, but you don't have a choice, and neither does anyone else, and so everyone sips and nods and sets the glass down and says nothing. I once watched a military gentleman take a single mouthful from his wine glass, hold it in his cheek for a long moment with an expression of mild bewilderment, and then quietly set the glass down and not touch it again. Nobody remarked on this. The wine went back into the decanter when he left, and the 2 glasses per person, that detail is important too. 2 glasses, never 1, because 1 glass would suggest that the household couldn't afford wine in quantity. 2 glasses says, we drink freely here. We pour a second without thinking, and the fact that both glasses remain empty, standing side by side like small crystal headstones throughout the entire meal, is something that everyone sees and nobody mentions, because the glasses aren't really there to be used, they're there to be counted. There's a beautiful sadness in all of this, and I don't want to make it sound heavier than it is, because it isn't heavy when you're inside it. It's just life. The gooseberries are fine, the wine is drinkable, the carpet is beautiful and the newspaper paths are clever, and the oranges, eaten alone behind a closed door in the late afternoon dark, are sweet. Every single one of these small arrangements is a woman saying quietly, with her hands and her scissors and her careful planning, that the world she lives in is the world she chose. And if it isn't the world she would have chosen, if there was once a bigger house and a better carpet and fresh fruit and wine that didn't taste like 3 Christmases mixed together, well, that world is gone. And this one, this careful, thrifty, newspaper-pathed, orange-sucking, gooseberry-drying world, is still worth getting dressed for in the morning. The afternoon is turning toward evening now. The light is low and golden, the kind that would send Miss Constance diving for the newspapers if she were here. But she isn't. And the carpet, faded now in places, softened by years of feet and sunlight, has outlived its fiercest protector. Miss Hatty doesn't chase the sunbeams anymore. She lets them lie. And I think there's a lesson in that, though she'd never call it a lesson, and I'd never say it to her face. When Miss Constance was alive, every small economy was a shared project, a 2-person campaign against the slow erosion of the world. They chased the sun together, they ate their oranges in separate rooms, but at the same time, a kind of parallel solitude that was, in its way, as intimate as sitting side by side. They counted the candles together and dried the gooseberries together, and stitched the newspaper paths together, and the togetherness was the thing that made it bearable, that made it more than bearable, that made it life. Now Miss Hatty does it alone, and some of the economies have fallen away, not because she's become careless, but because the person who made them feel important is gone. The newspaper paths stopped when Miss Constance stopped. The orange ritual continues, but it's lonelier now. One woman in one room, with no sister behind the next door doing the same thing at the same time. The gooseberries are still picked and dried, but Miss Hatty sometimes forgets to set out the dessert arrangement, and nobody reminds her, and the 2 empty wine glasses stay in the cupboard where they belong. But she hasn't given up, not on the things that matter. The carpet is still protected, not from the sun, but from muddy boots and careless feet. The candles are still watched, the bread is still cut thin, and the tea is still strong, and the caps are still changed when a knock comes at the door. And the oranges, when they arrive in winter, are still carried upstairs in silence, one by one, and eaten alone in the dark with the door shut and the juice running sweet. Some things you don't stop doing just because the person who taught you is gone. Some things you keep doing precisely because they are. The evening has come, the clashes are on, and 4 women are walking down a quiet street in the last light of a November afternoon, their wooden pattens clacking on the cobblestones like a slow, irregular heartbeat. Miss Hatty is in front because the pavement is narrow and the ladies of Wembury walk in single file when going to a party, and Miss Hatty walks carefully because her pattens are old, and the left one wobbles slightly on its hinge. Behind her comes Miss Finch, who walks with purpose, as she does everything, as if the pavement has done something to offend her, and she intends to see it corrected. Then me, and behind me, Mrs. Thornbury, who is wearing her good shawl and her second-best cap and has linked her arm through mine on the wider stretches because her hearing is not what it was, and she doesn't like to fall behind the conversation. We're going to Miss Caldwell's, the select party, the grand occasion that's been planned and discussed and worried over and apologised for since Tuesday morning, and I'm going to tell you about it in full, because it's the finest evening I've spent in Wembury, and the strangest, and the one that taught me the most about what elegant economy means when it takes its shoes off and sits down. Miss Caldwell's house is the old milliner's shop. You'd know it if you saw it. The front is narrower than the houses on either side, with a low door that used to have a bell above it, and a window that used to display caps and bonnets, but now shows a pair of starched curtains and a potted plant. The lobby behind the door is barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side, and the stairs are steep and dark, and the whole ground floor still has the feel of a place that was built for commerce and has been awkwardly, lovingly, stubbornly converted into something else. We arrive. The 4 of us stand outside the door in our calashes, silent, waiting. And then, from somewhere inside the house, upstairs, behind a closed door, comes a sound. It's not quite a cough and not quite a sneeze and not quite anything you've heard before. It's a small, strangled, deliberate noise, like a bird clearing its throat, and it serves a very specific purpose. It's the signal. Miss Caldwell has gone upstairs to wash her hands. She has told Polly, her round-eyed, slightly stunned-looking maid, who is standing behind the front door at this exact moment with her fingers on the latch, to wait until she coughs. When the cough comes, the door opens. Not before, because a lady does not greet her guests with wet hands or a flushed face. A lady is composed. A lady has been sitting in her drawing room, waiting serenely, and is pleasantly surprised when visitors arrive. The cough comes. The door flies open. Polly stands there, wide-eyed, somewhat overwhelmed by the procession of calashes that faces her, and for a moment nobody moves. Then we file in, one by one, ducking through the low doorway, and we find ourselves in the narrow lobby, in a small room that used to be the shop. The counter is gone now, but the shelves are still on the walls, and they hold, instead of ribbons and caps, a mirror, a brush, a basin of water, and several hooks for cloaks. This is the dressing room. This is where we unpin our calashes and shake out our skirts and smooth our caps and arrange our features into what Miss Constance used to call the company face, that particular expression of mild, benign, expectant pleasure that says, "I am delighted to be here and have no needs whatsoever." We do this in near silence, with only the rustling of fabric and the click of pins and the occasional murmured "after you, ma'am," as we negotiate the narrow space. Mrs. Thornbury, as the highest born among us, goes first up the stairs. She's been offered this precedence without being asked, because asking would imply that the question was in doubt, and it isn't. Mrs. Thornbury is an Ashford. She goes first. The rest of us follow, single file, up the steep, dark staircase, each step creaking under our feet until we emerge into the light and warmth of Miss Caldwell's drawing room. And there she is. Miss Eliza Caldwell, sitting by the fire as if she's been there for hours, as if she hasn't just sprinted downstairs, coughed through the wall, sprinted back up and thrown herself into her chair with 3 seconds to spare. She's wearing her best dress, dark silk with a collar of old lace that might once have been part of her stock in trade, and her face is composed, and her hands are folded, and she's smiling. She looks like a woman who gives parties every week. She looks like a woman for whom this is nothing out of the ordinary. And underneath that smile, underneath the composure and the folded hands and the carefully pressed lace, she's vibrating with anxiety and pride like a plucked wire. The room has been arranged with thought. The best chair, the comfortable one, the deep one with the cushion and the armrests, has been placed in the position of honour, near the fire but not too near, with a footstool in front of it and a small table beside it. This chair is for Mrs. Blackwood. Everyone knows this. The other chairs are arranged in a careful arc around it, each one slightly less comfortable than the last, in a precise hierarchy of upholstery that mirrors the hierarchy of birth. Miss Hatty gets the second best chair. Mrs. Thornbury gets the third. Miss Finch and I make do with straight-back things that might have come from the kitchen. And then, the sound of a sedan chair in the street below. A peculiar, rhythmic, squeaking sound, like a large wardrobe being carried by two mice. The chairmen, who are, in their daytime lives, shoemakers, but who own between them an ancient sedan chair and an even more ancient set of liveries, long greatcoats with small capes that look like something from a painting by Hogarth. The chairmen are manoeuvring Mrs. Blackwood's chair through the narrow lobby. There's a great deal of tipping and angling and backing up and trying again, and from inside the chair comes the occasional murmur of Mrs. Blackwood's voice, calm and unhurried, as if being wedged in a doorway were a perfectly normal part of an evening out. At last she's extracted. She appears at the top of the stairs, slightly pink, accompanied by Carlo, her dog, who bounds into the room ahead of her and immediately colonises the best chair. Miss Caldwell, with the smooth, unshakable grace of a woman who has rehearsed this moment in her mind 40 times since Tuesday, welcomes Mrs. Blackwood as if the Duchess of Devonshire herself has just stepped across the threshold. She's honoured, she's overwhelmed. She does hope the sedan chair wasn't too much trouble, and Carlo, poor sweet Carlo, must have his own cushion, mustn't he? Mrs. Blackwood settles into the best chair from which Carlo has been gently but firmly removed. She arranges her skirts. She accepts a cushion for her back. She looks around the room with an expression of benign, slightly drowsy satisfaction, and the evening can begin. And then comes Polly with the tray. I want you to see this, because it's the centrepiece of the whole evening, the thing that all of Miss Caldwell's anxiety has been building toward. The tray is enormous. It's loaded, genuinely loaded, not Wembury loaded, with food. There's bread and butter, yes, but it's been cut thick, buttered generously, stacked high. There are cakes, there are biscuits, there's seed cake. Proper seed cake, dense with caraway, the kind that Mrs. Blackwood has publicly stated on more than one occasion that she never has in her house because it reminds her of scented soap. The tray looks like abundance. The tray looks, frankly, like showing off. And it is. It is, just this once, a small, defiant, magnificent act of showing off by a woman who has spent her whole life not showing off, and who has decided, for one evening, to put everything she has on a tray and carry it upstairs. Polly totters under the weight. She comes through the door sideways, her face red with effort, her arms trembling, and Miss Caldwell watches her with a mixture of pride and terror. Pride in the tray, terror that Polly will drop it. And I'm glad to see it, because I'm hungry. We're all hungry. We're always hungry at Wembury parties, because the food is usually thin bread and sponge biscuits, and tonight there's actual substance on this tray, and the smell of fresh cake is filling the room like an announcement. But there's a moment, a small, quiet, complicated moment, when the tray arrives, and the ladies look at it and register collectively that this is more food than is strictly proper, more than they'd serve at their own houses, more than the rules of elegant economy allow, and each woman's face does a tiny, almost invisible calculation, the kind of social mathematics that the ladies of Wembury perform faster than any Cambridge scholar, and arrives at the same answer. We will pretend that this is normal. We will eat it. We will enjoy it. And we will not, by word or expression, suggest that Miss Caldwell has gone too far. And so they eat. They eat with appetite, which is itself a kind of compliment. Mrs. Blackwood, who has told the entire town that she cannot abide seed cake, eats 3 pieces of it. She eats them slowly, thoughtfully, with the patient, rhythmic chewing of a contented cow, and her face shows nothing but mild, absent pleasure. Miss Caldwell watches her eat, and you can see, if you know where to look, a small sunrise happening behind her eyes. The conversation is warm and easy. Miss Finch has news. Miss Finch always has news, gathered on her walks and hoarded like string until an occasion arises to spend it. Mrs. Thornbury nods along, catching one word in 3, but filling in the gaps with such convincing vagueness that you'd think she'd heard every syllable. Miss Hatty smiles at everyone equally, says very little, and enjoys the fire. And Mrs. Blackwood, in the best chair, with Carlo at her feet and the warmth of the seed cake settling in her stomach, begins to drift. Her eyes close, her chin drops, her breathing slows. And within 10 minutes of the tray's arrival, the Honourable Mrs. Blackwood is asleep. Nobody says a word. Nobody looks. Miss Caldwell, who is watching from her chair by the door, leans toward me and whispers, so softly that only I can hear, that it gives her the most extraordinary pleasure to see Mrs. Blackwood so perfectly comfortable in her humble home. She couldn't have wished for a finer compliment. And then she straightens and smiles and goes back to hosting her party as if the guest of honour were not gently snoring in the armchair by the fire. The cards come out. Preference. Always. Preference. The steady, gentle, endlessly recyclable game of Wenbury evenings. 4 women at the table, heads together, caps nodding, whispering strategy and bidding in voices that are kept low because Mrs. Blackwood is asleep and must not be disturbed. Miss Caldwell, who claimed before the game began that she barely knew the difference between one card and another, proceeds to defeat everyone at the table, with a ruthless efficiency that suggests her ignorance may have been slightly overstated. She apologises after each winning hand. She's terribly sorry. She can't imagine how that happened. I'm given a stack of old-fashioned magazines, handsome, leather-bound things, 10 or 12 years out of date, and a candle, and a small table in the corner. Miss Caldwell tells me kindly that she knows young people enjoy looking at pictures. Carlo lies on the rug at Mrs. Blackwood's feet and snorts in his sleep, occasionally twitching a paw as if chasing something through a dream. And then, the second tray. The door opens. Polly appears again, redder than before, bearing another tray, and this time, I understand why Miss Caldwell spent a week planning this evening and why she apologised 14 times before she even got to the invitation. Because on this tray are scalloped oysters, potted lobster, a dish of clear, trembling jelly, and something that Miss Caldwell introduces with a small, proud, slightly breathless flourish as little cupids. The little cupids are macaroon biscuits soaked in brandy. They're sweet and sharp and strong, and they're the kind of thing that costs real money, the kind of thing that no woman in Wenbury would serve at an ordinary party, because it would break every rule of elegant economy in a single bite. But this is not an ordinary party. This is Miss Caldwell's party. And Miss Caldwell has decided, with the quiet, iron determination of a woman who used to run a business and knows exactly what things cost, that tonight, just tonight, the rules can bend. The oysters are hot. The lobster is rich. The jelly catches the candlelight and wobbles gently when Polly sets the tray down, as if it too is slightly overwhelmed by the occasion. And the ladies, the careful, thrifty, bread and butter ladies of Wenbury, look at this second tray and something happens to their faces. Something softens, something opens, and they eat. They eat as if they haven't eaten properly in months, which some of them probably haven't, and the room fills with the small, satisfied sounds of people who are genuinely enjoying food, rather than politely enduring it. Carlo wakes up. Mrs. Blackwood opens her eyes with a start, looks around the room with the gentle bewilderment of someone returning from a long journey, and says, calmly and without embarrassment, that the room was so bright she'd simply been resting her eyes, but she'd been listening to our most amusing conversation with the greatest interest. Nobody contradicts this. Miss Caldwell offers her an oyster, and then comes the cherry brandy. Miss Caldwell produces a bottle of it from somewhere, a dark, sweet, warming liquor that she describes as something that is, just sometimes, after shellfish, you know, thought to be not quite unwholesome. She pours small glasses, very small glasses. She offers them around, and every woman in the room shakes her head. No, no, thank you. They couldn't. They really couldn't. They've never. They wouldn't dream of. Strong spirits are not something they... And then Mrs. Blackwood takes one, and within 30 seconds every other glass is empty. The effect is immediate and spectacular. These are women who drink watered-down wine from decanters full of 3-year-old dregs. They are not accustomed to cherry brandy. The liquor hits the back of their throats like a small fire, and the coughing that follows is explosive, sustained, and utterly at odds with the composed, ladylike, company-faced demeanour that has been maintained all evening. They cough, they gasp, their eyes water. Miss Finch sets down her empty glass and says, in a voice that has been scraped raw, that it's very strong and she does believe there's spirit in it. And Miss Caldwell, beautiful, anxious, triumphant Miss Caldwell, says, with the innocent confidence of a woman who knows exactly what she's done, only a little drop, just necessary to make it keep. You know how we always add a splash of brandy to our fruit preserves? Same principle entirely. I've been quite light-headed myself just from a spoonful of damson jam. I could have kissed her. The audacity of it. The sheer, brazen, perfectly delivered audacity, comparing cherry brandy to damson tart. As if the two were even in the same postal district of experience, as if the women around her, coughing, watering at the eyes, clutching their chairs, were suffering from nothing more than a slice of preserved fruit, and the women accept it. Of course they do, because this is Wenbury, and in Wenbury, when a woman offers you an explanation that saves everyone's dignity, you take it. You take it, and you hold it, and you fold it up, and put it away, like a cap with yellow ribbons, in the drawer of things that are true enough. Damson tart. Yes, of course, that must be it. The evening is winding down now. The cherry brandy has loosened something in the room. Not just the throats and the manners, but the mood itself. Mrs. Blackwood, warmed by the fire and the lobster and the brandy, tells us something she's been keeping quiet. Her sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, a baron's widow, is coming to stay with her, a real baroness, coming to Wenbury. There's a moment of silence, and then every woman in the room is simultaneously reviewing her wardrobe, her caps, her best shawl, her remaining candle supply. A baroness in Wenbury. The implications ripple outward like rings in a pond, but that's a story for another evening. For now, the candles are burning low, and the clock is approaching 9, and Miss Caldwell is looking at the door with the particular expression of a hostess who knows the evening has been perfect and doesn't want to risk spoiling it by letting it go on too long. The card table is folded, the chairs are pushed back, and downstairs in the narrow lobby, the sedan chair is being wrestled back into position for Mrs. Blackwood's departure. The chairmen, those ancient shoemakers in their Hogarth coats, edge and back and try again, fitting the chair through the doorway with the grim patience of men who have done this before and expect to do it again and would rather be at home by the fire. Mrs. Blackwood is lowered into it with ceremony. Carlo is placed on her lap and the door closes, and we hear the quick, steady pitter-pat of the chairman's feet disappearing down the quiet street. The rest of us put on our calashes. We pin up our gowns. Miss Caldwell hovers around us with offers of help, wanting to assist but holding herself back, because to help a lady with her cloak would be to remember her old trade, and tonight she is not a milliner. Tonight she is a hostess. Tonight she gave a party with lobster and oysters and cherry brandy and little cupids, and Mrs. Blackwood fell asleep in her best chair, and that is the greatest compliment that has ever been paid in the history of Wenbury. We step out into the dark. The street is empty. The air smells of coal smoke and wet stone and the faintest trace of November frost. And Miss Caldwell stands in her doorway, watching us go, one hand on the frame, her face lit by the candle behind her, and she is, in this moment, entirely and completely happy. The lantern goes first. That's the rule. Though nobody calls it a rule, it's just how things are done when the ladies of Wenbury walk home from an evening party. A man with a lantern, hired for a penny or two from the publican at the corner, walks ahead of them through the dark streets, holding the light high so they can see where the cobblestones are wet, and where the mud begins and where the drainage gutter runs across the pavement in a stream of black water that would ruin a pair of shoes in a heartbeat. The man tonight is old. He's always old. Not the same man every time, but always old. Always quiet. Always patient, as if lantern-bearing were a profession that attracted a particular temperament and then aged it further. He walks slowly, which suits the ladies perfectly, because nobody in Wenbury walks fast after dark. Speed is for emergencies, and emergencies are vulgar. The lantern swings gently as he goes, casting a circle of warm, swaying light that slides across the cobblestones and up the fronts of houses and catches now and then, the edge of a curtain, or the gleam of a brass door knocker, or the startled eyes of a cat sitting on a windowsill. We walk behind him in a line. Miss Hatty first, then me, then Miss Finch, then Mrs. Thornbury, whose arm is through Miss Finch's now because the pavement is uneven, and Mrs. Thornbury's eyes aren't what they were, and she's had a glass of cherry brandy on top of everything else, which hasn't made her unsteady exactly, but has given her a gentle, floating quality, as if her feet aren't quite touching the ground. Our pattens make a sound on the cobblestones that I've always loved, a hard, rhythmic wooden clacking, like tiny horses trotting, and in the quiet of a Wenbury evening it carries a long way. You can hear a woman in pattens from 3 streets over. You can hear the sound approaching and receding, growing louder as she comes near and fading as she turns the corner, and if you're lying in bed in one of these dark houses you'd know, just from the rhythm, how many women were passing and how quickly they were going and whether the evening had been a good one. Tonight the rhythm is slow. Nobody's in a hurry. The cherry brandy has left a warmth in our chests that the cold air can't quite reach, and the memory of the oysters and the lobster and the little cupids is still fresh enough to feel like a secret we're carrying between us. A small, shared, wonderful secret that we'll never mention to anyone because mentioning it would mean admitting that the food at Miss Caldwell's party was better than the food at anyone else's, and that admission would be vulgar. So we carry it silently, each of us, like the warmth of the brandy, and we walk. The town is quiet. It's not yet 9 o'clock, but Wenbury at 9 in November might as well be Wenbury at midnight. The shops are shuttered. The church is dark. The only lights are behind curtains, thin, wavering lines of candlelight leaking out through gaps in the fabric, each one a sign that someone is still awake, still sitting by a fire, still reading or knitting or staring into the coals. In an hour those lines of light will be gone too, and the whole town will be dark, and the only sound will be the watchman calling the hour and the distant bark of a dog who has heard something that nobody else has. We pass the draper's shop with its bolts of cloth propped in the darkened window. We pass the general store, its window dark now but still bearing the handwritten card that claims Queen Adelaide was spotted wearing a bonnet identical to the one inside, a claim the shopkeeper makes with cheerful regularity, and which nobody in Wenbury believes, but nobody can quite disprove either, since none of them have been to London recently enough to check. We pass the pump at the corner of the square, where the water drips slowly into a stone trough, and the sound of it, that steady, patient dripping, is the only sound in the world apart from our pattens and our breathing, and the quiet creak of the lantern swinging on its pole. There's something about walking through a town at night that makes everything feel closer. The houses lean in, the sky presses down. The street, which seemed wide enough by daylight, narrows to a channel of cobblestone between dark walls, and you find yourself walking in the exact centre of it, your elbows almost brushing the brickwork on either side. And the pattens, those ridiculous, wonderful, completely impractical wooden overshoes that every woman in Wenbury straps to her feet the moment she steps outdoors, the pattens turn the walk into a kind of percussion. 4 women, 8 pattens, 16 wooden heels striking stone in a ragged overlapping rhythm that sounds, from a distance, like a very small and very determined army on the march. I keep thinking about the pattens, about the absurdity of them. These hinged wooden platforms strapped to the soles of your shoes, raising you an inch or 2 above the mud and the wet, turning every step into a small balancing act. They're not comfortable, they're not elegant. They make your ankles ache and your calves tighten and your stride shorten to a careful, mincing shuffle that would make a dancing master wince. But they keep your shoes clean, and shoes in Wenbury are expensive. A pair of good leather shoes might last 5 years if you're careful, but one bad evening in the mud could ruin them in an hour, and then where would you be? Barefoot is wear, or wearing your second best pair every day, and your second best pair is already patched at the heel and softening at the toe, and if that pair goes too, then there's nothing left but the old slippers you keep by the bed, and you can't walk to a party in slippers. So you wear pattens, you strap them on, and you clatter through the streets like a one-woman percussion section, and you arrive at your destination with clean shoes and aching feet, and that's the trade you make. I think about this sometimes, about what it means to live in a place where everyone is in bed by 10:30, where the day ends early and the night is long, and the hours between supper and breakfast are filled with nothing but darkness and sleep, and the slow, deep quiet of a town that has decided collectively to stop. It isn't laziness, it's economy. Staying up costs candles, Staying up costs coal. Staying up costs the kind of energy that these women can't afford to spend on anything except getting through tomorrow, which will be exactly like today, which was exactly like yesterday, and which will require the same caps, the same calls, the same 15-minute visits and thin bread and careful, watchful thrift that this day required. And there's a comfort in that, isn't there? In the sameness. In knowing that tomorrow the clock will tick to the same hours, and the bread will be cut to the same thinness, and the candle will be lit at the same time, and the knitting will begin where it left off. The women of Wenbury don't live in a world of surprises. They don't want surprises. Surprises cost money or feelings or both, and they've arranged their lives so that neither is required. What they want is the quiet satisfaction of a day well managed. Every penny accounted for, every call returned, every cap in its place. And if that sounds small from the outside, from the inside it feels like something much closer to peace. Miss Finch is talking. She hasn't stopped talking since we left Miss Caldwell's doorstep, and her voice in the dark is a steady, relentless, surprisingly comforting stream of observations, opinions and predictions. She has thoughts about Mrs. Blackwood's sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, who is coming to visit. She has theories about what Lady Glenmire will be like and what she'll wear and how she'll expect to be addressed, and whether she'll play preference or consider it beneath her. She has opinions about the proper way to receive a baron's widow, and she's sharing them with Mrs. Thornbury, who can't hear a word but is nodding vigorously and saying indeed at intervals that have nothing to do with the rhythm of Miss Finch's sentences, but give an excellent impression of attentive listening. Miss Hatty walks ahead of us, quiet, her calash bobbing gently in the lantern light. She hasn't said much since we left the party. She ate the oysters and praised the lobster and drank the cherry brandy and coughed like the rest of us, and she played cards and lost a few pennies and smiled and said she'd had a lovely evening, which she had. But now, in the dark, walking home, she's gone somewhere else, somewhere inside herself, where the evening's being folded away like a good shawl, carefully, gently, laid in the drawer of pleasant memories to be taken out and looked at again on some future afternoon when the parlour is cold and the knitting is dull and she needs something warm to think about. The lantern-bearer stops at the corner where Miss Finch's street branches off. Miss Finch says her goodbyes, brisk, efficient, a handshake rather than an embrace, because embracing would be excessive and excess is vulgar, and disappears into the dark, her pattens clacking away down the side street, growing fainter, fainter, gone. Mrs. Thornbury goes next at the lane that leads to her baby house dwelling, and she squeezes my hand as she goes and murmurs something I don't quite catch, and then she's gone too, a dark shape moving slowly toward a darker door, and then the faint sound of a latch, and then nothing. And now it's just Miss Hatty and me, and the lantern-bearer, and the long, quiet street that leads to Miss Hatty's house. We walk in silence for a while. The lantern swings. Our pattens clack. The air smells of coal smoke and frost and the faintly sweet, faintly rotten smell of autumn leaves decomposing in the gutters. It isn't cold enough to see our breath. Not quite. But it's close, and I pull my cloak tighter around my shoulders and wish, not for the first time, that I'd brought a thicker shawl. And then Miss Hatty speaks. She says very quietly, almost to herself, that she thinks Miss Caldwell's party was the finest evening she's had in a long while. She says the lobster was very good, and the oysters were very good, and the little cupids were... She hesitates, searching for a word that captures both the pleasure and the mild scandal of brandy-soaked macaroons at a Wenbury tea table. Very unexpected. And she says, in a voice so soft I have to lean in to hear it, that she wishes her sister could have been there. I don't say anything. There's nothing to say. I just walk beside her, and the lantern goes ahead of us, and the light slides across the cobblestones, and somewhere a church clock strikes the quarter hour, and the sound hangs in the cold air for a long time before it fades. We reach her door. The lantern-bearer tips his hat, a minimal economical gesture, the kind of tip that costs nothing and conveys everything, and moves on down the street, his light growing smaller, dimmer, until it turns a corner and disappears, and we're standing in the dark. Miss Hatty finds her key. She's had it in her glove all evening, pressed against her palm because a lady doesn't fumble at her own front door. The lock turns, the door opens, and the house breathes out at us. That familiar smell of cold rooms and old wood and the faintest trace of Tonquin beans from the chest upstairs. Annie has left a candle burning in the hallway. Just one, of course. It's guttering low, nearly spent, but it gives enough light to see by as Miss Hatty unpins her calash and hangs it on the hook behind the door. She takes off her pattens and sets them neatly by the step, side by side, the wood still warm from her feet. She loosens her cloak and drapes it over the chair by the stairs, and stands for a moment in the narrow hall, breathing in the familiar smell of her own house, the wood smoke, the cold plaster, the faint sweetness of Tonquin beans drifting down from the chest upstairs. The parlour door is ajar, and through it I can see the 2 candles on the mantelpiece, level, ready. One burned tonight, one waiting for tomorrow. The fire has gone out, but the grate still holds the faint ghost of heat from coals that were lit this afternoon and have been dying all evening while we were away. In the morning Annie will clear the ash and lay the fire again, and the whole cycle will begin. The same coals, the same match, the same slow burn, the same thin warmth that has to last until tea time. Miss Hatty climbs the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, and I hear her footsteps cross the landing above and the creak of her bedroom door, and then silence. I stay downstairs for a moment. I stand in the hallway of this narrow, quiet, candlelit house, and I listen. I can hear the clock ticking in the parlour. I can hear the last coals shifting in the grate. I can hear, very faintly, the sound of Miss Hatty moving about in her room above, the soft thud of a shoe being set down, the rustle of a shawl being hung, the small, precise click of a cap pin being placed on the dressing table. And then I hear her blow out her candle. Tonight's candle, the left one maybe, or the right. I've lost track. One small breath, and the light goes out, and her room is dark and the day is over. I think about this town as I climb the stairs to my own room, about its women and their candles and their caps and their careful counted bread, about the way they walk through the rain and call it fine, and wear old ribbons and call them chosen, and eat their oranges behind closed doors and never ever in all their lives say the word that must not be spoken. I think about Mrs. Thornbury's tea tray under the sofa, and Miss Caldwell's cherry brandy, and Mrs. Blackwood asleep in the best chair, and Miss Finch's endless, unstoppable, deeply comforting stream of news. I think about the lantern-bearer, whose name I don't know, walking home through the dark to his own house, his own fire, his own bed, having lit the way for women who would rather walk than ride, and who would rather be cold than admit they can't afford to be warm. And I think about Miss Hatty, about the yellow ribbons folded in the drawer, about the 2 candles on the mantelpiece, standing level, standing ready, standing guard against a question that nobody will ever ask. About the way she said in the dark walking home that she wished her sister could have been there, and about the way she said it, not sadly, not bitterly, not with the weight of grief that comes from losing someone you loved, but with the quiet, simple, matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who has been missing someone for so long that the missing has become part of her, like breathing, like knitting in the dark, like keeping blind man's holiday. The house is quiet. The town is quiet. Somewhere out there, past the shuttered shops and the dark church, and the empty streets where the cobblestones are still wet from the afternoon's rain, the watchman is walking his rounds, and the last light in Wembury is going out. I blow out my own candle, the room goes dark, and somewhere, in every small house, on every narrow street in this strange, proud, stubborn, tender little town, a woman is lying in the dark, and the day she is carried so carefully, with its caps and its calls and its candles and its counted pennies, is setting itself down. Sleep comes easily here. It always does. The town is asleep now. Every candle is out. Every door is locked. Every cap is off and folded and laid on its dressing table. And every pair of pattens stands by its front step. And every fire has burned down to ash. And the only light left in Wembury is the lantern-bearer's, swinging slowly through the empty streets on his way home. And somewhere in the dark, in a narrow house on a quiet street, Miss Hatty Pemberton is lying in her bed with her eyes closed and her hands still. She isn't knitting. She isn't counting stitches. She isn't watching candles or chasing sunbeams or folding envelopes inside out. She's just lying there, breathing, in a room that smells faintly of Tonquin beans and wood smoke, and the day is done. I want to stay here for a moment, with her, with all of them, with Mrs. Thornbury and her tray under the sofa, with Miss Caldwell and her cherry brandy and her little cupids and the pride that lit her face when Mrs. Blackwood fell asleep in her best chair, with Miss Finch, who was almost certainly still talking in her own bed to nobody, rehearsing tomorrow's news, with Mrs. Blackwood, who is dreaming of seed cake she claims not to like, with Carlo curled on the rug at her feet. These women didn't change the world. They didn't write books or lead armies or build anything that lasted beyond the lifetime of a Turkey carpet. What they did was smaller than that and harder. They held their lives together with string and candle ends and India rubber rings, and they called it elegant, and they meant it, and they were right. Because elegance isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with the not having. It's about the thin bread cut just so, and the cap change before the knock, and the 2 candles standing level on the mantelpiece, and the whole, quiet, stubborn, extraordinary refusal to let poverty take away the one thing that costs nothing at all, which is dignity, which is grace, which is walking through the rain in wooden shoes and calling the night fine. They did that every day, and nobody wrote it down and nobody remembered, and the world moved on without noticing, but they were here, and their bread was thin, and their tea was strong, and their curtains were white, and they were enough. If any of that stayed with you tonight, if you found yourself thinking about a candle, or an orange, or a woman knitting in the dark, I'd like to hear about it, whenever you're ready. A few words in the comments, whenever morning comes. There's no rush, it can wait. And if you'd like to come back to this place, this quiet place, where the stories are long and slow and nobody asks anything of you, then we'll be here. We're building something small, this channel. We tell stories from all kinds of times and places, medieval castles and ancient cities and old kitchens and quiet parlours, and we tell them the way they ought to be told at night, slowly, gently, with the lights turned low. If you'd like to walk with us a while longer, you're warmly welcome to subscribe, so that the next story can find you when you need it. And if not, that's all right too. You've already given us the best thing you could give, which is your time and your quiet and your willingness to listen. Thank you for that. Truly. And now, the last light in Wenbury has gone out. The watchman has called the hour. The streets are empty and the cobblestones are wet, and somewhere a church clock is striking very softly in the dark. Sleep well. And if you dream tonight, dream of a small town where the bread is thin and the tea is strong and nobody has much of anything except each other. It's a good place to rest. Good night.